Randall Carlson, welcome to the show, man.
Well, thanks for having me, Shawn. It's great to be here.
It's my pleasure.
Been looking forward to this.
It's my pleasure.
And here it is. It's actually happening.
I first saw you on the Ancient Apocalypse series with Grant Hancock, and that really caught my interest. And then I saw you on Rogan, and then that just took me down the whole rabbit hole.
Oh, good.
So, I'm really excited to have you here. I love these kind of topics. So we're going to talk a lot about ancient technologies and ancient civilizations and some of the stuff that you're doing now with education.
Oh, sounds like a good format.
But yeah, so let me start off with an introduction. Not that you need one, because I've seen you all over the place, but you investigate and document catastrophic history of the world and the evidence for advanced knowledge in earlier cultures. You're a geologist, architectural designer, teacher, geometrician, geomythologist, geological explorer, and renegade scholar. You've been doing research for over 50 years into the interface between ancient mysteries and modern science, recognized by the National Science Teachers Association for your commitment to science education for young people. Acclaimed in 1997 TBS CNN documentary Fire in the Sky was based upon your research into earth change and catastrophic events. Organized several dozen field expeditions documenting evidence for catastrophic earth change. Host of the Cosmographia podcast, and for over 25 years, you have presented classes, lectures, multimedia programs synthesizing this information for students of the mysteries.
Well, let me clarify a couple of points, because there's always people, what the hell is a geomythologist? Well, a geomythologist, now that is now becoming a recognized scientific discipline. And what that is basically scouring ancient documents and ancient records and accounts, could be mythology, legends, whatever, to get insight into geological events and geological change. And we're going to pull up some examples while we're here, so, to show, examples. And I was talking to Kimball before we started the show here, and I mentioned the discovery of Troy. Now, Troy, there was the famous Trojan War that happened about 3,000 years ago, and this is a good example of the efficacy of geomythology. Is that Schliemann, who was the archaeologist who discovered the lost city of Troy, when everybody else, the establishment, believed it was purely just a myth, he actually used clues that he got from reading Homer and the myths and stuff, and he went and found the ruins of Troy. And it was accepted. So that was kind of like, okay, maybe there's merit to looking at some of these ancient traditions. And since then, it's kind of evolved into a whole sub-discipline of geological research, in that a lot of these ancient accounts can actually provide very important insight and clues and information into ancient geological events.
Yeah.
So that's what geomythology is. It is not some weird, something that has been concocted up. It actually has value. And there's, sort of a counterpart to that. It's called astromythology, because we know that ancient peoples all over the world were very, very interested in what was happening in the sky. Mm-hmm. And so astro refers to the stories and the myths about things that are happening in the heavens, in the sky, in the celestial realm. And, again, we're finding out that, there's merit to that. That we can actually derive valuable, usable information. I take the story of Marduk battling Tiamat in this Sumerian tradition. And, astronomers even like 40 years ago were looking at that and going, well, wait a second, it could be that, people are witnessing some kind of like fireballs, or maybe the breakup of a comet or some such thing as that in the sky. And that became the basis for recording this myth.
Interesting.
Same with, Zeus battling dragons in the sky. There's many myths. The Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent in the New World stories. I mean, again, all over the world, like stories of dragons and flying serpents and things like that, and wars in the heavens. And so there's actually a group of astronomers now, particularly it started in England, like in the early 80s, late 70s, where they're looking at these myths and going, well, maybe these are records of things that people actually witnessed or experienced firsthand.
Well, I can't wait to dive in. We had we touched on a couple subjects at breakfast that really, really caught my ear. But, one thing that I think everybody is kind of coming to is, the ancient Egypt, the pyramids and a lot of these mysteries of the world, Stonehenge, Easter Island, the pyramids, Machu Picchu, and how all these seem to line up, with the stars line up with each other. And I think I don't know too many people left that are buying the ancient Egypt. The pyramids were built with by lifted stone that weigh tons, thousands and thousands of pounds with sticks.
I mean, a lot of those stones are 50, 100, 200 tons, even bigger than that.
It's almost interesting that even wound up in the educational system to begin with, and I mean, when I was going through, nobody challenged it.
No,
and now today it seems to be the complete opposite.
Yeah, I mean, people are really beginning to question. And the thing is, you could look at it as an anomaly. And one culture at one point in history said, hey, you know what? We're going to quarry and move 200-ton stones just for the heck of it. But you see the thing all over the world. All over the world, they're doing these incredible structures with these massive stones. And, as a builder, I have, had to move heavy weights sometimes. And, of course, we'll bring in cranes and things, which presumably they didn't have back then, or front end loaders, or lift up a 1-ton beam. You know.
Do you have how do you think that was done?
I've been asked that question a lot of times, and I don't know the answer. I last year in February, I went down and interviewed with Tucker Carlson. He contacted me, said he wanted to interview me. I didn't know what he wanted to talk about. I get down there, that's what he wanted to talk about. We get in his studio, and he says, how did they do that? And I said, well, to be honest, I don't know. I've been thinking about this for decades. I don't know. I have some ideas of which direction to go now that I didn't have even a year or two ago. However, my understanding of the science of it is not to the point yet where I feel like I would fall on my face if I attempted to explain these thoughts that I have had about how such a thing might be accomplished.
I need to introduce you to my friend Chris Beck. But
okay,
fascinating guy.
So you got some ideas?
He is. He used to work for he was a SEAL, and then he worked for the Pentagon. He's basically, in a nutshell, a mad scientist, and just a brilliant.
We like mad scientists, actually.
A brilliant mind, but he talks a lot about everything is frequency and vibration.
See, that's exactly the direction I would go.
And do you believe in 0-point energy?
I haven't researched it enough to say I believe in it, but I do think that there are forms of energy that are orders of magnitude more efficient than anything we're using today.
I mean, if you put... I believe they were able to harness some type of energy out of the earth to move those. I don't see any other way.
That's exactly the direction I would go with it.
And, I mean, if you put if you just put a block or a paperweight or whatever on a table or on top of a speaker and apply frequency and vibration, it moves on its own. And so if you had some people guiding where that needed to be moved, that seems to be the only... I don't know how the hell you would do it or how you would harness the energy or create frequency and vibration to be able to vibrate the earth to get people. I mean, basically, we're talking about levitation, and I just don't see any other way how to do it. But it seems to be the only logical explanation that.
I think levitation was probably a scientific reality to ancient cultures.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the stories about the Ark of the Covenant, it was sheathed in gold, and it would have been extremely heavy. Would have been very difficult for people to lift and move. And I've seen some calculations of how heavy the damn thing would have been. And, it was carried on staves because no one, according to the accounts, no one could touch it, lest they would get fried somehow. But I noticed, interestingly, that, the tribe that was the only tribe that was allowed of the 12 tribes to actually transport and move the Ark of the Covenant. Do you know which tribe that was?
I do not.
The Levites.
The Levites.
Levites. Levity. Levitation.
Got it. Got it.
And, having looked into some of these mystery religions like Kabbalah and stuff that say that there's hidden meanings to the words in the language, homonyms and synonyms and things that, that's the whole basis of the Kabbalistic system. That caught my eye, and I thought, that's an interesting coincidence.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, before we get too far into the weeds here, and I can't wait to get there, I have a Patreon, and I give everybody, they're the reason I'm here, they're the reason you're here, they're our top supporters, and so I give them an opportunity to ask the guest a question. So this is from Dylan.
Okay.
And Dylan wants to know, here's his question. What were some of the hypothesized steps that our surviving ancestors took to survive a 20 to 30 degrees Celsius environmental temperature change and build back a new society?
Okay, I don't know of temperature change that extreme, although we're looking at some very extreme. I mean, we're looking at 10 to 12 degrees Celsius, which would be about 18 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. But that's way beyond anything we've experienced in recent times.
Yeah.
Coming out of the Little Ice Age 150 to 200 years ago, temperature of the planet has warmed about a degree. So we're looking at warming of 20 times that much. And some of the studies based on ice cores, Greenland ice cores, Antarctic ice cores, other kinds of proxy evidence, the time span in which this temperature change occurred has gone from 1,000 years to a century, then from a century to a decade, then from a decade to 5 years, and now the latest, as we get to this ever more refined temporal resolution, like from the studies of ice cores, it's down to 1 to 3 years. So what happened? That's a mystery. Now, what did people do? That's a very interesting question to me. Like, you need to find a place of refuge to ride this thing out. Because at the same time these extreme temperature changes are happening, the whole surface of the planet is being remodeled in a major way. So one of the things that would absolutely be necessary is to find the places of refuge. Now, in ecologists, when they look at the decimation of the whole ecosystem, like a great microcosm of that would be the Mount St. Helens eruption of 1980, when you had about 200 square miles just utterly decimated, turned into a lunar landscape. Well, you've got biologists and ecologists and stuff have been studying how nature has reclaimed that. And what usually happens is you have these pockets where some seeds or whatever, spores primarily, because the first colonizer plants that show up in the aftermath of catastrophe are ferns. And so this is what happened. You have these pockets of life recovering, and then from those little islands of life, of biological activity, it spreads out. And at the rate that it's been recovering, it's been, 40 years now since that big eruption. And it's probably, there's now forests encroaching upon the area of devastation. Give it another 50 to 100 years and it should be completely recovered. Now, the question is if we're faced, because to me, two questions. One, the historical question, because we now know that these tremendous catastrophes have happened and have happened repeatedly. So And then if they happen again, for example, we know that asteroid and cometary impacts are way more frequent than anybody was imagining a generation ago. Excuse me, I'm a little hoarse today. But interestingly, what we've seen in, say, in the last 25, 30 years is that geologists looking at the Earth down below have seen multiple scars from these tremendous cosmic events, impacts of asteroids and meteors, comets and cometary debris. There's right now about 200 craters and or astroblems that have been discovered. Now, an astrobleme is an impact scar, but it's usually buried beneath the surface. It's called, literally translates as star wound. Star wound. Now, most of those are the result of high-density objects like iron asteroids. Have you ever been to the crater in Arizona near Winslow?
I haven't.
Okay, add that to your list. You need to get out there and see it. This is. You'll get out there and you're going to be looking in this 600-foot deep hole, a kilometer wide, and you're going to go, that's one big hell of a big hole, right? But that was like a little baby piece of cosmic debris that excavated that hole. It was an iron asteroid about 150 feet in diameter, right? Most of the asteroid pulverized upon impact, and pieces of it are strewn out for miles from the crater itself. In the museum there, you can see there's a hunk of the iron. It's maybe about like so big, you know. Now, when you have a high density, and we're talking, 5 or 6 grams per cubic centimeter, when you have a high density object like that coming in at hypervelocity speeds, it'll penetrate through the whole atmosphere and strike the ground. Now, if you have a lower density object, like, say, have you ever heard of the Tunguska event of 1908?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so in 1908, a piece of a comet. It was probably related to the comet we called Comet Encke, which was probably part of a family of meteors called the Taurid meteor shower, which the Earth crosses this stream twice each year. Okay, so that piece is estimated to have been about 150 feet in diameter. So now, on the one hand, the hole you've got in Arizona, the big crater bowl that you've got in the desert in Arizona, was created by, like, almost think about it, cast iron, and roughly the density and weight of cast iron. The Tunguska event, on the other hand, was more like almost like a snowball. But when that thing came in, again at hypervelocity speeds, it penetrated the atmosphere. It happened on June, by the Gregorian calendar, it would have been June 30th in 1908. That thing descended through the atmosphere, but was moving so fast that the atmosphere, in effect, didn't have time to get out of the way. The lower density of it meant that, like when the Department of Defense dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those bombs didn't fall and strike the ground and explode. They were blown up in the atmosphere. Why? Because you've got a greater kill radius. You've got a greater radius of destruction. Whereas if it hits the ground, most of that energy is absorbed into the ground. And the blast wave, if you detonate it in the atmosphere, that blast wave can move out much more to a greater distance. So Tunguska in 1908 exploded 5 miles up in the atmosphere with the force of about a 15 megaton hydrogen bomb. The largest hydrogen bomb ever tested by the U.S. back in the 1950s was called Bravo, 20 megatons, right? So this is almost in the range of the biggest hydrogen bomb that the U.S. Department of Defense ever tested, right? As a result of that explosion, over 820 square miles of old-growth taiga forest was just utterly obliterated and flattened. Under the epicenter of that explosion, about 200 square miles were just incinerated to nothing, right? Now we have two contrasting episodes there. Now one, we have an iron asteroid strikes the Earth. We have a low-density object, probably a piece of a comet, blows up in the atmosphere, right? Now, The reason we know about the Tunguska event of 1908 is because of two things: the devastation, but also the accounts that this is a very remote region of Siberia, northwest of Lake Baikal, very remote region, and so the Tungusi tribes people that lived there were reindeer herders, and as far as we know, there was nobody killed directly by the blast because it was just at the northern limits of the tree line. If it had been much far, maybe another 50 miles north or 100 miles north, we wouldn't have known about it. The reason we know about it is because, number one, even though this was very remote, when this happened in 1908, there were still accounts that made their way out. And a scientist, a Russian scientist by the name of Leonid Kulik, he was studying meteoritic phenomena, and he heard about this, and he decided he wanted to follow up on this. So I think it was 1927 or 1928, he journeyed to this small village, Vanavara, I think is what it was called. It was the closest human habitation to this event. And he found out, they confirmed, there was this thing, but they were very superstitious about it. They did not want any outsiders to go there because they felt like it had been a visitation from the fire god Agni. And they witnessed this thing from the distance, and it completely, they were so blown away by what happened. And then, of course, some of them traveled in but the only thing that was probably killed in mass was reindeer herds. So some of the reindeer herders had gone up looking for their reindeer, and of course they could find no trace of them. They'd been just incinerated and obliterated.
So did this explode in the air?
It exploded in the air.
Okay.
Exploded about 5 miles up. So that's a major difference between these two. Now, if we think of the objects, the cosmic objects that could strike Earth, those are the two endpoints of a continuum. The high-density iron-type objects and the low-density cometary-type objects, and then you can have everything in between. So you're talking about roughly 1 gram per cubic centimeter, which is like a piece of ice, or 5 grams per cubic centimeter, which is going to be like a piece of cast iron. And then like in the middle, you've got what are the chondritic meteorites that are about 3. So if you went out next to a creek and you picked up your standard piece of rock, sedimentary rock, it's going to be about 3.5 grams per cubic centimeter. So that's right in the middle of the spectrum. Now, here's the thing I'm getting at. When we start crater counting to try to understand how many times the Earth has been impacted, we're looking at objects that actually strike the Earth. Mm-hmm. Now, if you had an event like Tunguska, 1908.
How many, I'm just curious, do you know how many times the Earth has been struck by some type of a meteor or a comet?
That's what I'm getting at.
Perfect.
That's exactly what I'm laying it out so that, right? So here's the thing. If you have an event like Tunguska, 100 years from now, there won't be any trace of it. The trees that were knocked down will have all been rotted away, and there's new forests growing there, right? And we wouldn't even know about it, right? Whereas the Arizona event, Meteor Crater, that happened some 50,000 years ago. So that big hole in the ground is still there, right? And we can see it, we can count it. Well, like I said, there's about 200 craters and astroblems that have been identified on Earth.
200?
About 200 now.
Wow.
Is the census. Now,
I just have another question
sure.
real quick. How are you able to date when an asteroid hits the Earth?
Well, there's a number of different ways. Optically stimulated luminescence is probably the main way now that you can date rocks. But, you can use relative dating, where if like, for example, if you got layers of soil,
okay,
right, and you go out and you dig a hole, right, now you come back afterwards and you look at that hole and we've cut through this layer, but not this layer. So we know it's younger than this layer, right?
Got it.
Now let's say we've got remains of life forms in there that we can date. Well, now we can date some of these layers. Or optically stimulated luminescence, not to OSL dating, not to try to get into a technical discussion on that, but it basically is that you have certain atomic structures that are reset when they're exposed to light. So if you've got a crystal that's buried, what's happening is it's through radiocarbon process. It's decaying and producing byproducts.
Okay.
Right? And by measuring the ratio of the precursor material and the byproducts, and you know how long that rate of transition is occurring, you can now get a relative date. The younger stuff, like the other way is this. Okay, so you dig that hole and you go away, and now things start, wind blows, things blow into the hole, plant life falls into it and it starts filling up, right? Well, then you can go and you can maybe date the stuff that's in there, in the hole. And if you go back and you pull up and you do core samples and you take and you date those, and the oldest dates turn up to be 50,000 years old, that's probably going to give you an indication of when it happened. And that's kind of how they dated the Arizona thing. Now,
okay.
the 1908 event, that was witnessed. So, I mean, there are accounts of that. But here's the thing I'm getting at. The lower density objects are about 10 times more abundant than the iron objects. So, and then when you look at the actual craters and astroblemes, most of those are on places where there's fairly dense human habitation: Europe, Scandinavia, Canada, the U.S., Russia. More and more of them are being found in Russia. What's under Antarctica? We don't know yet, but there's evidence that there's a really big crater under the ice in Antarctica. What about the bottom of the oceans, which is almost 3/4 of the planetary surface? For every one that's going to hit the ground on land, there's going to be 3 that hit the ocean. And so now you have marine geologists who are reevaluating evidence for large-scale tsunamis that have made landfall and thinking that some of those are too big to have been formed by simply undersea volcanic eruptions, and may be the result of, a half-kilometer or kilometer-wide object plunging into the ocean that's moving, at 20 miles per second, right? Mm-hmm. But my point, and this is the takeaway, is that the events like Tunguska that don't leave a lasting impression are way more abundant than the ones that dig holes in the ground. So if you're just counting holes in the ground or scars in the surface of the earth itself, you're going to be undercounting. That's my point. So we're kind of in a position now of reevaluating just how many times perhaps we have been affected in the past. And here's again, now we turn to astromythology or geomythology, and we have hundreds of accounts from all over the world of things that once you got this picture in your mind of what an event like that would be, mm-hmm. It sounds like that's what they're talking about.
Interesting.
Yeah.
How many do you happen to know how many documented cases are maybe within the past, 200 years?
Of impact type events?
Yes.
Well, the big one, of course, was 1908.
Okay. But
there's also evidence now of a similar event happening over Brazil in the 1930s.
Really?
Yeah. There's also evidence that there might have been a similar type event, maybe even bigger, over New Zealand.
What is the evidence?
Well, the evidence, and the first thing, like in the Brazil event, that was, who was it? I think it was some Catholic priests that were going in there to try to convert the natives, and they started hearing these tales, and then later, some scientists went in there and they found what looked like that there had actually been 3 strikes of 3 objects that came in together. And individually, each one was smaller than the 1908 event, but taken together, the total energy released may have been in that scale.
Wow.
And I mean, there's the evidence is accumulated. There's a researcher, a geomythologist named Bruce Massey, who's done some incredible work on studying, and it's come to the conclusion that these events are far more frequent than anybody had imagined, 20 or 30 years ago.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, I've got it all documented here. So when, I've been doing this for a long time, and I've spent pretty much every hour of my spare time for 40 years collecting this stuff.
It's interesting. It's
Yeah,
interesting.
and I visited just about all of the craters in America, a couple of them in Canada, but there's a lot more. You know, I've done, in fact, there's a chain of them across the Midwest. I think it's at about the 34th parallel. I think there's 8 of them. And it might have been a multiple impact event. Now, this would have been a long time ago before humans, but like, imagine, do you remember the 1994 July? Do you remember Shoemaker-Levy 9? Think about when there was a multiple impact into Jupiter. I think it was the second week of July, 1994.
I do not remember that.
What were you doing in 1994?
I was probably in middle school.
Okay, that would explain why. Now, see, the crime there is that you were probably in middle school and you didn't have any teacher telling you about this.
We were learning about ancient Egypt and how they propped those blocks up with sticks.
Oh, really?
That's what I was doing in 94.
Oh, 94, okay. Well, in 94, so this, at the time, it was the most watched astronomical event in history. And in 15 months earlier, in March of 93, astronomer David Levy and astronomer Carolyn Shoemaker, wife of Gene Shoemaker, who was a famous, he trained NASA astronauts and stuff when they were going to the moon. He was a geologist. And so David Levy and Carolyn Shoemaker, who was Gene Shoemaker's wife, discovered, they were looking at Jupiter and they saw a comet just making an appearance. It had just orbited around Jupiter and it was just appearing from behind Jupiter when they discovered it. So it was like discovery of a new comet. Suddenly there it was, coming from behind Jupiter. They began watching it, and over the next few days and weeks, they could see that the thing had broken into pieces. And so what had been a single nucleus turned into 21 new separate individual nuclei. And the reason that happened is because, first of all, comets aren't really cohesively and solidly bound. The nucleus can be fragmented fairly easily, right? Jupiter has this intense gravity field, and there's a principle called the Roche limit, where an object coming too close to a larger body like Earth or Jupiter or whatever, if it passes within that Roche limit, the gravity is so strong that it'd overcome the bonding of the object and it'll fragment. It'll literally, the gravity of Jupiter tore this comet nucleus apart. So the astronomers started tracking and they could see these pieces spreading out in space. They called it the chain of pearls. And it took about 3 months of observations. And within that 3 months, they were able to recreate the entire elliptical orbit of the thing. They were able to determine, because of the velocity of it, they now had the velocity of these pieces and they had the geometry of the orbit. So they sort of fast forwarded it and they go, okay, in July of next year, July of 94, it's going to it'll recross the orbit of Jupiter. But here was the interesting thing. When it's recrossing the orbit of Jupiter, guess what? Jupiter is right there. So they knew that it was going to be an impact, and they predicted this a year in advance. So I believe it was the second week of July, 1994, 21 pieces slammed into Jupiter. Any one of those pieces, had it struck Earth, would have caused a global catastrophe and probably pulled the plug on our civilization.
Wow.
Wouldn't have been an extinction level event, but it would have been enough to basically put us back to the Stone Age.
Wow.
And there were 21 of those pieces, and up until that point, no one had ever expected that they would witness such a thing as that. So that was an important milestone in thinking about catastrophism and the probabilities or possibilities of such a thing happening on Earth.
Do you just back to the Patreon question? Do you have any? Do you think about that? How humanity may have survived or sought refuge?
Well, you want to turn back to mythology?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it.
If we were faced with something like, if we can go back to now, what's almost certainly a
This
real
is strictly
event.
in mythology.
Okay, so here we got mythology, and here we have scientific evidence that Earth was blasted around 12,900 years ago by a multi-impact event.
Okay.
A smaller version of what happened to Jupiter. Okay? Now, we've been around, modern humans have been around for probably a couple of 100,000 years. So the event that happened is called the Younger Dryas. Younger Dryas was initially it was an extreme climate event that was documented in Europe because it's named after a flower called Dryas octopetala. Dryas octopetala is a polar wildflower that loves the cold. So when these botanists and whoever was studying the plant, they saw that it was growing in Europe during the Ice Age, when Europe was 10 degrees colder than now, and then it disappeared for about 1,300, 1,500 years, and then it suddenly came back again. So from that, they concluded, well, you've got this cold-loving flower that was there, then it was suddenly gone, and then it reappeared. So you had this interval where it warmed up, and the flower didn't like the warm weather. And then it came back again, so that means the cold weather came back. Now, the Younger Dryas, that was how it was first identified, like 30, 40 years ago, was the study of this polar wildflower. Well, since then, we've learned all kinds of interesting things. One is that the mass extinction of the great megafauna that lived during the Ice Age, there was, over 100 species of megafauna that did not survive the end of the Ice Age, right? I mean, when was the last time you saw a woolly mammoth roaming around the forests of Tennessee?
It's been a minute.
It's been a minute. But 12,000, 13,000 years ago, you had several species of elephants living here in Tennessee.
Interesting.
You don't think about elephants, you think Africa, India, but you don't think North America. An elephant is a proboscidean, meaning it has a long snout, a long nose. Up until the end of the last Ice Age, there were 4 species of proboscideans living in North America. Think about that. Mm-hmm. They're all gone now. What happened to them? Well, there's different theories. One theory, which I think considered to be ridiculous, is that they were hunted to extinction by nomadic tribes of hunters. But given that the estimates for the human population at the end of the last Ice Age, and we're talking 12 to 15,000 years ago roughly, those estimates of total global human population range between 5 and 10 million. Estimates for total number of mammoths, 12 million.
Wow.
12 million mammoths. That's just an estimate, but it's probably in the ballpark. Now, let's say you got 10 million people. How many of those people, now that's women, children, elderly, how many of those are going to actually be hunters? And hunters that are capable of taking down a mammoth.
It's 25% or less.
What?
25% or less.
That's probably about right, yeah. So what does that leave? A couple of million people were able to exterminate every mammoth on Earth in less than 1,000 years?
No way.
No. And then when we look at the circumstances under which we find those mammoths and other extinct animals, that's not, we find them frozen in permafrost. There was a Rogan podcast where he had John Reeves, who's a gold prospector, and he owns a large tract of land in an undisclosed location in Alaska. On his land, there's a valley that's filled with permafrost. When you dig into that permafrost, half of it is the remains of extinct megafauna. Bones, twisted ligaments, pieces of muscle that have been, skin that had been frozen. It looks like they took a whole ecosystem, dumped it in a gigantic blender, blended it all up, and then dumped this shit in the river valleys of this area in Alaska. Now, those kinds of things have been documented for over 200 years. Explorers up there seeing that kind of stuff. Coming out of the Yukon, coming out of Alaska, coming out of Siberia, for years and years and years, they were exporting mammoth tusks, ivory, right? To this day, a lot of old pianos built in the 1800s and stuff have mammoth ivory that are the keys. Thousands and thousands of those tusks were dug out of the permafrost. They didn't end up there from human hunters. They were destroyed in some type of a catastrophe. The most likely trigger for catastrophe, I think, is from out there. And in some of the bone beds up in those areas, they've now discovered iridium, platinum spikes, which are delivered to Earth via cosmic impact. That's how they discovered that, originally came up with the theory that the dinosaurs had been killed in this great impact, was because they discovered a layer that's right there at that KT boundary layer, 66 million years old, below which you had dinosaurs and above which there were no dinosaurs. In the late 1970s, they took a closer look at that layer, and they discovered it was more than 100 times richer in iridium than below or above that layer. They said, where the hell did all this iridium come from? Well, they knew that iridium is delivered to Earth via cosmic impact. So this was a group that was looking at a KT boundary layer in Italy. And they contacted their colleagues, first in Denmark, then in New Zealand, because they were trying to determine, well, how widespread was this? It looks like there was a dusting of iridium. Well, they contacted their colleagues in other places around the world, and they said, go back, take a closer look at that KT boundary layer and see if there's an iridium spike. And in every case, there was an enormous enhancement of iridium, which led them to then believe that the entire planet got dusted with iridium. So how do you do that? Well, again, you blow up an asteroid and you distribute its debris pulverize it so that its debris is microscopic, and you inject that into the atmosphere, and the atmosphere carries it around the planet. From the concentration of iridium, they were able to calculate, and based upon, we know that two things. When we pick up meteorites in the field, they can measure the amount of iridium or other group, platinum, ruthenium, zirconium, other platinum group metals. They can actually measure directly in the meteorites. Then you can look at the spectral emissions of asteroids, and those substances will have very distinct spectral signatures. And so they were able to estimate, okay, we've got X amount of iridium. Given the percentages of iridium that we know is in an asteroid, how big of an asteroid would it have to be? And they came up with they did the math on it. So it's going to have to be about 6 miles in diameter. Then they said, okay, if you've got a 6-mile diameter asteroid with a closing velocity of 20 miles per second, what size crater is that going to create? 150 miles, roughly, in diameter.
Holy
so they
shit.
speculated, said, somewhere there must be a 150-mile crater if we're right. All the skeptics were saying, well, until you can show us the crater, we're not buying into this, because that's too drastically different than our old models of gradual extinction, right? Well, at the same time, Petroleum Mexico is drilling, in the northern Yucatan Peninsula. And they had drilled down about through a half a kilometer of limestone sediment, and at the bottom of that drill core, they hit something hard. They brought up samples of it. It was this green, vitrified, really dense glass-like material. Their first assumption was volcanic. Well, word of this eventually got to some American scientists that were trying to figure out what happened at the KT boundary. They went down there, they got more samples, and they started doing subsurface surveys, and they could see that there was a giant circular structure buried under a half a mile of limestone. And this green vitrified stuff was the rock that had melted in the superheated temperatures that were created by this impact. They've gone on. I mean, they, for example, have found the remnants of gigantic tsunamis in Louisiana and Texas that were washed north. So it was a long process, but this occurred in like the early 90s. So in 1980, 3 teams separately proposed that the extinction of the dinosaurs at the KT boundary was triggered by an impact. The team of Walter and Louis Alvarez, who studied the outcrop in Italy, theirs seemed to be the most accurate in terms of what we now know happened then. But it took a decade for them to be vindicated, and it was with the discovery of that huge crater and the dating of that crater that, again, right there, 66 million years ago. Right? Now, of course, that was long before humans. Now, fast forward to the Younger Dryas, the lower Younger Dryas boundary, which is dated just a little bit younger than 12,900 years. Iridium has been found. Platinum has been found at that. Nanodiamonds have been found, which are microscopic diamonds. And the only other place that diamonds just like that have been found, the KT boundary from 66 million years ago.
Wow.
So it's almost certain that but we still have large factions of the scientific community that doesn't want to go there, doesn't want to admit that there could have been a global catastrophe 12 or 13,000 years ago. And, part of the political narrative now is that humans are causing the 6th great mass extinction, and Exhibit A is the fact, oh, look what humans did to the woolly mammoths. They exterminated them all. So there proves that humans can cause mass extinctions. They don't want that to be taken away from them, so they're refusing. That's part of it. But there's a whole group of them that just, as the evidence continues to accumulate, they just do not want to go there. At some point, it'd be really you should get George Howard.
George Howard. He
has a website called the Cosmic Tusk, and he's been in the forefront of this research probably since the 80s.
Interesting.
Right? He's also was one of the co-authors of a paper that came out in 2007 that proposed that the mass extinction was caused by some type of an impact. That was 2007. And that ignited a firestorm of controversy. It's gone back and forth and back and forth. But at this point, I think 8 to 10 teams around the world have independently verified that there is the fingerprints of a cosmic impact event that occurred around 12,800 to 12,900 years ago that seems to be right there along with the mass extinction. Now, back to the question, which is where would people have survived? And were such a thing to happen again, where could people survive? Well, there are places around the world. Like, for example, if you look in Africa today, where's the greatest concentration of megafaunal species in the world today? Africa, right? If we look at a census, continent by continent, what we see is that North America lost 3/4 of its megafaunal species at the end of the Ice Age. South America lost about the same percentage. Eurasia lost about 35%. Africa only lost 10%. That's why Africa today has the greatest number of megafauna. When you start thinking about, and let me define megafauna. A megafauna is defined as any animal that weighs over 44 kilograms in body weight, which is right about 100 pounds.
Okay.
So if you take the census of animals living on Earth today, there's about, and depending on how you divide them up, do you separate timber wolves from gray wolves? Do you separate African elephants from Indian elephants? Probably you do, but there's some variability in there. But let's say there's roughly 100 to 120 species of megafauna around the planet. It's about equal to the number of megafaunal species that went extinct around the world. So to put that in perspective, what that means is that you would have to, the number of species that got wiped out at the end of the last ice age, and there's an argument about, was the span a decade, 100 years, several thousand years? That's still being worked out, although it looks like it's honing in right at this boundary, which is dated at 12,900 years ago. Okay, so if you were going to duplicate a species extinction level event to the one that happened at the end of the last ice age, you'd have to pretty much eliminate every animal over 100 pounds body weight on Earth.
Okay.
That's how severe the mass extinction was.
Wow.
And that's not even considered one of the great ones in Earth history. A great one in Earth history, you're talking about 70 to 90% of all species, terrestrial, marine, etc. Permian-Triassic may be as much as 95% of all species on Earth went extinct, just like that. And they're still trying to figure out why, But so now, here's the interesting question. We can see from the, number one, species loss is going to be directly related to habitat loss. The greater the loss of habitat, the greater it will affect species that are adapted to living in that habitat. So you can conclude from that if 3/4 of the species of North and South America went extinct, that was where the greatest habitat loss occurred. So it was the last global catastrophe was kind of focused on the Western Hemisphere. Eurasia was second, Africa was third. So what that tells you is the safest place to have been on Earth during these events would have been Africa. Mm-hmm. And I suspect that it all pretty much is around Kenya, Tanzania, that's what I'm trying to say, thank you, around the Great Rift area.
Okay.
That's where it seems like was kind of a place of global refuge. You had the greatest survival of species, and once the dust settled in the aftermath of these events, they were able to repopulate.
So nobody really sought refuge. It was just luck of the draw where you were on the
Well, now you get down to a really interesting question. I think that the plausible scenario might be that you had survivors of two types. Those who survived by the luck of the draw, and those who survived because they knew it was going to happen. They planned for it. They prepared for it. And
you think they knew it was going to happen?
I think we could make a strong argument that somebody did know.
How so? How would they have known?
Well, see, this is where we now get into why ancient peoples all over the world were such obsessive sky watchers. And how did astronomers were able to predict this impact on Jupiter a year in advance? Now, I think that we could make the argument that there was, whatever you want to call them, a priesthood or whatever, whose job it was to monitor the skies for generation after generation. And typically, one of the things that would happen is that impacts, right now, we could think of Earth, we could think of Jupiter. And there are streams of stuff traveling between the two, almost like cosmic ping pong or something, right? Now, every year on June 30th and two times, right around late October, early November, late June, early July, Earth crosses this stream of cosmic debris that's called the Taurid meteor shower. The peak of that, now, it takes, to fully cross the stream, takes a couple of weeks, right? But the Tunguska object, if I come back, we can look at some really cool graphics.
Pull them up.
Well,
if you'd like.
I don't know if I've got that open, but when we do the break, I'll pull some stuff up, okay? Picture this. You've got this stream of debris coming in from Jupiter, coming around the sun, and going back out to Jupiter. The whole stream takes between 3 and 4 years to make an orbit around, like this, right? Now, here comes the Earth. It crosses the stream twice, right? Once in late October, early November. When it crosses, at that time of year, it's crossing in such a way that if you were to look up the stream, you'd be looking out into space. In fact, you'd be looking towards the constellation of Taurus. That's where it gets its name, the Taurid meteor shower, after the constellation of the Bull. Now that stream comes around the sun. Now if Earth is crossing there in late June, early July, and you're looking up the stream, as these things are approaching, you're looking almost directly towards the sun. So you don't see them. That's what happened on June 30th, 1908, is that thing came from around the sun. And the people that did see it in the last few seconds, they described things like it looked like it was being born out of the sun, or the sun spit it out, and they see this thing suddenly in the sky, and then it gets brighter than the sun, and then the damn thing explodes. And you had people 40 miles away from the epicenter of the explosion who were literally like blown off their feet and thrown 20, 30 feet in the air.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that was how the pressure wave that went out from that, right? So, what I'm leaning towards is the idea that you had people who were watching the skies and predicting this. And one of the reasons, now, again, showing graphics to explain this would be much easier. But when you look at and make these predictions of, like when they made that prediction back in 93, that this thing was going to hit Jupiter, they used a set of information called cometary elements, or the orbital elements, right? And what they need to know is the shape of the orbit, its tilt relative to Earth's orbital plane, and several other things, right? Well, the things that modern astronomers used to count, the conceptual tools they used to make that prediction, are all the things that you can identify by using the ancient standing stone circles and observatories. I think all these things all over the planet were observatories by which they were able to calculate cosmic motion to a high degree of precision. And if you saw an object circling, in that orbit, and just like with the Shoemaker-Levy 9, that thing had been circling Earth and Jupiter, but nobody had seen it, right? It had been doing it probably dozens of times, and nobody had seen it. But what happened is that every time it went out to Jupiter, Jupiter's gravity was sucking it in a little closer, a little closer, a little closer, until finally it got so close it passed within that Roche limit, ripped it apart, and then on the next circuit around, boom.
Gotcha.
Direct hit.
Gotcha.
Now, maybe there were ancient people with enough sophistication to see things in the sky multiple orbital periods before impact.
Very interesting. On that note, let's take a break. What if in 2024 you get a little bit better every day? When you're learning a new language with Babbel, that's exactly what you're doing. And if Babbel can help you start speaking a new language in just 3 weeks, imagine what you could do in a full year. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. 7 days a week at any time of day and taught by over 450 certified teachers so you can learn on your schedule. Browse more than 20,000 classes offered every month. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Me, I love to travel, but not knowing the language of where I'm going can be tough to navigate. Babbel's convenient courses have helped me learn real-life conversational skills like ordering food and asking for directions, and it makes traveling a breeze. Studies continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours could be equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, you get 55% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/SRS. Get 55% off babbel.com/SRS, spelled BABBEL.com/SRS. Rules and restrictions may apply. Visit babbel.com for terms and details. Here's the situation. You've got China, Russia, Ukraine, the border. The banks seem to be collapsing. Plus, the Chinese just negotiated with Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil to drop the US dollar. And most Americans, including myself, feel that we're in a recession right now. But despite all the evidence, I can't tell you what's going to happen for sure. Nobody can. Yet when it comes to your money, you should understand what's at stake. That's why I partnered with Goldco to possibly help at times like this. Go to ShawnLikesGold.com or call 855-936-GOLD to get your free gold and silver kit. The kit shows you how to defend your money with precious metals and how listeners of the show could get up to $10,000 in bonus silver. Go to ShawnLikesGold.com or call 855-936-GOLD to get your free gold and silver kit. I can't predict the future, but I can certainly prepare for it. So go to ShawnLikesGold.com or call 855-936-GOLD now. Performance may vary. Consult with your tax attorney or financial professional before making an investment decision. All right, Randall, we're back from the break. Something I forgot to do. Everybody on the show gets a gift.
Even me?
Even you.
Oh.
Even you.
Gosh.
There you go.
Well, check this out.
Yeah, those are...
gummy bears. Okay.
Vigilance Elite Gummy Bears, made here in the U.S., legal in all 50 states. Fortunately.
So are they CBD infused or?
Just gummy bears, man.
They're what?
Just gummy bears.
Just plain old gummy bears.
Just plain old gummy bears.
So I'm not going to get high if I eat these gummy bears.
No, you won't. We did have somebody email in once that said they were on their 5th bag and they still don't feel anything yet. But,
okay.
Yeah.
Oh, not just one bag, but 2 bags
there
of
you
gummy
go.
bears.
You know, a little something for the ride home.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, 1 bag. Yeah. I'm going to fall consume a whole bag on the ride home, but I'll probably share these around with you.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
what else is in here?
Oh, it's just some stickers and stuff like that.
Well, Shawn Ryan Show. Okay, well, otherwise people they won't believe that I was actually on your show. Look at this. Okay, Vigilance Elite. I like it.
Right on.
Vigilance. Absolutely, man. Love that logo.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But, so we had a little side conversation downstairs about a study that was done on children who grow up in and around nature, and kids that grow up just with technology. And
I pulled it up here on my laptop, so I will just I'll just selectively read. I'm not going to read the whole thing, this is the title of this article is "Scientists Discover a Major Lasting Benefit of Growing Up Outside the City." So I'll just read a few highlights here. Using data from 3,585 people collected across 4 cities, scientists from the Barcelona Institute for Global Health report a strong relationship between growing up away from the natural world and mental health in adulthood. Overall, they found a strong correlation between low exposure to nature during childhood and higher levels of nervousness and feelings of depression in adulthood. Co-author Mark Newen Hewson, don't know how to pronounce his last name, PhD, director of IS Global, this is Institute for Global's Urban Planning, Environment, and Health Initiative, tells Inverse, the journal that was doing this interview, that the relationship between nature and mental health remains strong, even when adjusted for confounding factors. Quoting him, "What we found is that the childhood experience of green space can actually predict mental health later in life.
Wow.
The people that reported more exposure to nature actually have better mental health than those that don't, even after we adjust for exposure at the time of interview when they are adults." Let's see. For one thing, many studies have noted nature's ability to reduce rumination, a risk factor for mental illness. Spending time in nature, this is one of the other researchers, Zalema says, has been linked with increased self-esteem, this is in nature, increased self-esteem, quality of life, and physical activity, as well as lower body mass index. In this sense, nature itself is beneficial. These findings fold into the biophilia hypothesis, the idea that humans intrinsically seek out connections with nature, including exposure to green spaces. An offshoot of this idea is that nature promotes certain developmental changes in the brain, particularly in children, that may not happen when we are removed from it. Nieuwenhausen presented some evidence for this in a 2018 study showing that exposure to green space correlated with structural changes in the brain and greater working memory in 258 school children. And then quoting him, "This is a hypothesis. I think the reason for it is in general our brains are still wired for when we were still living in the savannas and jungles with a lot of nature around us. It's only in the last few hundred years that we have moved into cities. Our brains are not really adjusted to that." The second way to interpret the results is to consider not the benefits of nature exposure, but the disadvantages of being away from it. Polluted cities in particular seem to extract additional tolls on health and may actually impact cognitive development in children. These negative aspects of being removed from nature highlight the indirect way that growing up in a city could have lasting effects. In other words, the way we're designed our cities is inherently harmful. Finally, let's see. We cannot really say how much exposure exactly there should be. Children that have poor residential access to nature could certainly benefit from field trips in nature, but it would probably be better if there's regular exposure at home and school. There's a image here of a brain scan. Let me make this a little bit more visible. I can hold it up. And this shows that exposure to green space was linked with structural changes in white and gray matter volume in the brain, suggesting that there might be a causal relationship between cognitive development and exposure to green space, and those yellow showing where the structural changes are taking place.
Wow.
In the brains of children who are being regularly exposed to nature.
Wow. Fascinating stuff, isn't it?
Isn't it, though? Yeah. And I got another study, where it's talking about the, some of the difference. I mean, just the mental health of people, of children grow up to be much more healthy in terms of their emotions, their psychology, their mental processes, and so on, than children that are deprived of that. So I think that's important. It's important for people to know that. And then I have a comment here where I say the proportion of rural to urban dwellers in America has shifted dramatically in the past 3 to 4 generations, creating an imperative need for opportunities for people to reconnect with the natural order. This is especially important for children and young people who will inherit the earth and must become its stewards as the 21st century unfolds. And we've basically shifted from 3 or 4 generations ago where 3/4 of the population was rural, And now it's 3/4 of the population are pretty much urban dwellers.
Yeah.
And you got kids now who, I've talked to kids that are teenagers who've never seen the Milky Way galaxy.
Man.
That's not good.
Yeah.
That's not good. And schools aren't living up to what they should be doing.
Well, they got their own agendas nowadays.
Yeah. What we found is that childhood experience of green space can actually predict mental health in later life. The people that reported more exposure to nature actually have better mental health than those that don't even after we adjust for exposure at the time of the interview when they are adults. So interesting stuff.
Yeah, very, very interesting.
Yeah.
It's I think since 2020, there's been nothing like what you're talking about for the last three, the last three generations, moving into the urban environment. But you did see a wave after 2020 of people trying to get back out into nature.
Oh, yeah.
And
it's interesting. We saw a similar thing, in the late 60s and early 70s, people who started experimenting with psychedelics and stuff. There was the Back to the Land movement.
Yeah.
And that it was a mixed bag because a lot of people from my generation tried to do it and weren't prepared for what it actually involved. It's a lot of work going back to the land.
Yeah.
No,
it is.
I had a sense of that, growing up where I grew up, in rural Minnesota. But, there was a lot of naivety. The intentions were good, but there was a lot of naivety. And, but you're right. Now, after the COVID, a lot of people are thinking, hey, maybe we should revive some of those ideas. And we know a whole lot more now about how to do it.
Yeah.
And what's involved. You just don't go out there and, build you a little lean-to and, it's a little more than that.
Yeah. We live out there and there's no way in hell I would ever move back to the city.
Yeah.
Not a chance.
Well, like we talked about earlier, my building business kept me tied to the city because that's where all my clientele was. But now that I'm shifting out of that into more teaching and podcasting and stuff and making a living doing that, and I did pretty good last year, but, I spent it all. I built a barn and I built my studio.
Yeah.
So my next surplus funds is going to be, going into actually getting my house that I live in, finishing the projects that I've started, and then I'm going to have a nice, generous chunk of equity in there, and that's going to be my springboard. But we'll see. I've got other things going on. I'm going to be going down the end of next month to meet with the Rumble guys, and I'm going to see what they're going to propose to me.
Good.
But they're, I've seen some projections that, if I get X number of views, I can actually get start getting some serious revenue streams going from it.
Good for you.
Yeah, and so that's going to go towards, I've been for a couple of years now researching land east of here, looking at eastern Tennessee, and I think that's probably where I'm going to try to relocate.
Well, you'd make a hell of a neighbor, so I hope that happens.
I'd be proud to be your neighbor.
Thank you,
Shawn. Yeah,
right
we
back
could
at
hang
you.
out more. I'd get you out there, and I could show you some cool stuff about building.
I would love that.
Because my vision is that I would like to take a piece of land and utilize the ancient principles, which, starts with things like simple but really cool, like putting a pole in the ground and using that pole to determine the directions and all the alignments. And you don't just build at random. You orient it towards the sky like they always did. That's a universal principle we find over and over again. Every continent where we find ancient sacred structures, they're orienting to the movements of the heavens.
Hold on. How do you do that with a pole then? And what are you orienting it to?
Well, okay. So first thing you do is you put a pole in the ground, and then you would draw a circle around it. Now, in the old days, they would use a knotted rope or a chain with links, and you could determine the length of the chain by the number of links. And typically, a lot of the chains that came from Europe the links were carefully manufactured to be 0.792 degrees, which is interesting because then you get certain numbers like 7,920 inches, right? And that gives you some interesting geometric correlations. But anyways.
Like what?
Well, correlations like one of the ancient units of measurement is a furlong. And the only place that I know of that a furlong is still used today is in horse racing. It's 1/8 of a mile, 660 feet. Well, if you translate that into inches, it's 7,920 inches. Now, interestingly, if you took the Earth, the Earth is not perfectly spherical. It's rotating, so its mass moves towards the equator. It's called an oblate spheroid, right? So the diameter of the Earth varies by 26 miles. The equator is 26 miles longer than the polar diameter.
No shit, I had no idea.
Yeah, hey, if it wasn't for that, man, we'd be screwed. The Earth would be wobbling all over the fucking place. Yeah, so you could think of it this way. If you traveled from the equator to the North Pole, you've gone downhill by 13 miles.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that oblateness, it acts like a flywheel that stabilizes the Earth, right? So it goes from equator 7,926 miles, give or take a little bit, pole 7,900. 26 miles different diameter. So if you go from the center, the geometric center of the Earth out to the surface, the difference is 13 miles between equator and pole. But if you took a perfectly spherical Earth, the diameter of that perfectly spherical Earth that had the same surface area as the actual Earth, it'd be 7,920 miles. Same number of miles as there is inches in a furlong. Now, you could argue, well, that's just a coincidence, of course. But interestingly, if you took, and I in my building business, I have a fiberglass measuring tape. It's 150 feet long. I've gone out into huge fields and parking lots, and I've laid out a furlong, right? I've brought people out. We lay out 660 feet, like in a pavement of a parking lot, and then I mark off 1 inch. And I say, look at that inch. Now look at, and I'll have somebody walk all the way down 600. That's over 2 football fields. It's 2 football fields plus another 120 feet. Walk on all the way down to the end of that furlong and stand there. They're way down in the distance waving. Okay, so now look at that. Now we're going to mark out 1 inch. And I say, here, do this. Take your thumb, put it down there, and I take a piece of chalk and mark either side of their thumb. And I go, okay, there's 1 inch. That's where the inch came from. It was originally the digit of your thumb.
Oh, good.
Just like the foot. Just like the cubit, elbow to fingertip, right? That inch that we just marked to this furlong is the same ratio as 1 mile is to the diameter of the Earth. That's a very interesting mental exercise to do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But that number shows up in a bunch of other interesting places as well. There's a legend about Joseph of Arimathea, who was generally considered to be the uncle of Jesus Christ. And it was in his house that the Last Supper was held, right? Mm-hmm. Where Jesus had the cup and they drank, all the disciples drank of the cup and ate of the wafers. It was all ritualized. It was Joseph of Arimathea that went to Pontius Pilate after the crucifixion and asked Pilate to release the body of Christ to him. And Pilate didn't believe that Jesus was already dead because he'd only been on the cross 6 hours. And crucifixion was designed to be a long, slow, agonizing death. So Pilate sends the centurion out. He says, go see if he's actually dead. the tale goes, and you have to kind of piece it together from the four Gospels. Centurion goes out, pierces the side of Christ, describes blood and water issuing forth, but there was no response from the body hanging on the cross. He goes back and he says, yeah, he's dead. I stuck him with the lance and he didn't respond. He's dead. So Pilate says to Joseph of Arimathea, yeah, go ahead, take the body. So he goes up there and he takes the body down. And according to the legend, now this isn't in the Bible, but according to the legend and the stories, he had this cup that was used at the Last Supper, and he caught the blood and the water coming out of the side of Christ. He sealed it up, and after a whole series of adventures post-crucifixion, he eventually makes his way to England. And he presents himself to a tribal chieftain there named Arviragus. And he comes there with 12 disciples, and he tells Arviragus he's there to establish a new church. And Arviragus gives him 12 hides of land. A hide is an ancient British unit of land measurement that's equal to 120 acres. So 12 hides of land means 1,440 acres. Now that's a Bible that has recurred reiteratively in the Bible. There's in the book of Revelations that describes the holy city descending from God out of heaven, and it has it's 12,000 furlongs in the King James. The length, the height, and the breadth of it are equal. The city lieth 4 square, and the length, the height, and the breadth of it are equal, 12,000 furlongs. Okay, well, turn 12,000 furlongs into feet, you get 7,920,000 feet. Lob the last 3 zeros off, and you've now got 7,920.
Interesting.
Now, Joseph of Arimathea gets this sacred precinct. At the center of the sacred precinct, he builds a little circular church, 39.6 feet in diameter. How do we know that? Well, because every time the original circular church at the center of the sacred precinct, which was 1,440 acres, 12 times 12 hides of land, right? Every time it fell into disrepair, it was repaired or restored, and the original dimension of that circle was carefully preserved all the way down until the Middle Ages, 1,000 years later, and an abbey was built there, and a small chapel was built adjacent to the abbey. And it was built in the form of a rectangle, but the width of that rectangle preserved the original diameter of that circular church that was at the center of the sacred precinct, 1,440 acres. Well, if you then take that 1,440 acres and draw it as a square, we don't know for sure if it was a square, but if you did, that square on its side would be 7,920 feet. So in other words, the inch to the furlong is the same as the mile to the earth. The foot to the side of the sacred precinct at Glastonbury, where this is happening in England, is the same. It's 1 foot to 7,920 feet. So the foot is to the side of the sacred precinct in the same ratio. I could keep going with examples like this, see? And this is where it gets, to me, really kind of weird and bizarre. Because, you're the skeptic, the reductionist is going to immediately knee-jerk say, it's all just a coincidence, you're playing with numbers. But it happens over and over and over again. And it's almost as if there is this proportional template that, well, the way it's been described is the ancient master builders were attempting to replicate the processes by which God built the universe. This is why Freemasons refer to God as the great architect, because God was working. God geometrizes. Sometimes Freemasons refer to God as the grand geometrician, that all of creation has this geometry inherent in it. And when you start looking, it's there. Yeah. You can see it, to the point where, no, you cannot dismiss this as coincidence anymore. Yeah. There's some kind of a pattern here. And I don't claim to ultimately know what it is, but I can show examples. And in my classes and lectures and stuff, I show example after example after example in how there's a certain set of numbers that recur over and over and over again, and they're found on sacred structures all over the world.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of documentaries covering the pyramids.
Yeah, have you seen the work of Robert Edward Grant?
I've been eyeing him up.
Yeah, check out his work. He's done some amazing things on all the pyramids on the Giza Plateau. And again, what you mentioned earlier about moving big stones and frequencies, he's done some really interesting work showing. And I had a recent interview with him. I was on his podcast, and he showed me, and this is one of the few interviews I've ever done where the host talked more than I did.
Right.
I was all ears, though. I was absorbing it, and I was sitting there with my calculator, fact-checking everything he's saying, Yeah, okay, yep. And then there was the overlap, honing in on the number 432, which is interesting. 432 recurs over and over again. In the Sumerian king lists, the total number of the total number of the 10 kings of ancient pre-deluge or antediluvian kings, the reign of the 10 kings, the mythical kings, is 432,000 years. And then when you go to the Vedic traditions of India, you have what are called the yugas, these great grand cycles of global earth change. And they're all built upon a sequence that goes 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the shortest epoch is the Kali Yuga, 432,000 years. So from the Vedic tradition, it gets the same number as the total of the reigns of the 10 mythical kings in ancient Sumeria. Then you go double that. Double that is 864,000. Triple that is 1,296,000. And if you lob a few zeros off that, you have 12,960, which is within 1 century of the last great global catastrophe, which was the Younger Dryas. Now, science has dated that event and said, yeah, here's this global catastrophe, without any reference at all to the fact that these numbers show up in ancient traditions, talking about these great epochal cycles of time.
What is the God frequency? Is it?
I don't know what that is. I've heard of it, and I don't know. I wish I could answer every question that everybody has, but I can't.
Yeah, I don't have my phone on me. Back to reason I'm curious. I told you I'm building the studio.
Yeah.
So the pole.
Okay.
What do you orient your buildings
now,
to?
You put the pole in the ground, and then you choose a length. It should be some sacred length, right? You draw a circle. Now, the pole should have a sharp point on the end. And now, when the sun rises in the east, it's going to cast a shadow to the west, right? Mm-hmm. Now, let's say the sun, wherever it is, whatever time of year it is. If it's after summer solstice, it's going to rise in the southeast. If it's before the summer solstice, it's going to rise in the northeast. But in either case, as the sun is rising, if you've got a picture in your head, the sun is rising up, it's arcing over. Excuse me, at high noon, the sun, at solar noon, that sun is going to be the highest in the sky that it's going to be for that day. And then it swings down and it sets in the west. Okay, now, as it's rising in the east, there's a long shadow that's cast to the west. Now, two things are happening as the sun is rising. The shadow is getting shorter, but it's also swinging around, so that at high noon, when the sun is due south at its culminating point, as it's called, in the arc of its position in the sky, the shadow of the pole is going to be pointing due south. Right? Mm-hmm. So now you've got a southerly direction defined right there for you by the pole. Now, as the sun is rising, The shadow is like this. The sun is rising, the shadow is swinging around, but it's also getting shorter. So at some point, depending on how big your circle is and how far it is removed from the pole, at some point, at some time during mid-morning, say, maybe 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, the shadow, which is getting shorter and shorter, you've drawn this circle around it, right? Now the shadow is getting shorter, and the point of that shadow, when it touches the circle you've drawn, you drive a stake there into the ground. Now, the shadow gets shorter and shorter. It's going to be the shortest that it is at noon when it's due south. Then as the sun is setting in the west, the shadow is swinging around and growing long again. And then you got to have somebody there, obviously, but then at the point when late afternoon, the point of the shadow hits your circle, you drive a second stake there. You string a line between them, and that's an east-west line. And now you've got your north-south axis, and you've got your east-west line. And so now you've laid out the 4 cardinal directions. Now, from there, you can begin to use geometry to lay out whatever you want. You want a square, you use geometry. You want a rectangle, you want a circle, you want an ellipse. From that point, you're working. See, now you've created essentially the 2 fundamentals of a Cartesian coordinate system, an x-axis and a y-axis, right? Mm-hmm. And now you can lay out any geometry you want on it if you know the rules of geometry.
We're doing that. We're going to do that.
Absolutely.
I'm going to call my builder out right now. Austin.
Okay.
We're resetting those flags, buddy.
I like that.
Yeah, that's cool. I love that. I tell you what, I gotta get my phone here because talking about all these numbers here, that's weird. It's 111.
That's interesting.
I gotta know the God frequency here real quick.
I've heard of it. I couldn't tell you what it was, though.
I'm into frequency stuff.
Well, yeah.
963 hertz.
963 hertz. Well, okay, so 9 plus 6 plus 3, that's 18. 1 plus 8 is 9. The whole set of these numbers, pretty much like, think of it, 432, 4 plus 3 plus 2, 9. 7920, 7 plus 9 plus 2, 18. 1 plus 8 is 9. We could go over and over. Look at the yugas. I said 864,000 for the Dawaparya yuga. 8 plus 6 plus 4, 18. 1 plus 8 is 9. The Treta yuga, 12,900 or 1,296,000. So 1 plus 2 plus 9 plus 6, 18. 1 plus 8 is 9. Over and over again.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Let's see if I have something open here. Here is the diatonic scale. So you've got, for example, the octave of C vibrates at 528 cycles per second. 528, right? The G vibrates at 396 cycles per second. So there's G and there's C. Now, I said that the original circular church was 39.6 feet.
369. 369.
396.
Well,
But
those numbers just keep intermingling.
Yeah. So take the 39.6 times 10, you have 396, which is the vibrational rate in cycles per second of G. C is 528. Add a 0 onto that. Now you got the number of feet in a mile. Now, where's the origin of the mile? I've looked it up. I've tried to find it. Nope, I can't find anything. It's just apparently very, very old. Now, we can go to Stonehenge, and Stonehenge is laid out on a geometric template. If you draw a circle around the outer face of the big Sarsenstone sandstone circle, it's right at 105.6 feet. That's the diameter. So if I was going to recreate Stonehenge, I would go out and I would draw a circle 105.6 feet in diameter from a center. And then for the blue stone, which is a rhyolite stone, I would draw a circle that's 79.2 feet in diameter. Or the radius, my chain, my rope, whatever I'm using, would be 39.6 feet in radius. And I would draw a circle, and I would now have 79.2 feet, and that is the diameter of the blue stone circle within a few inches at Stonehenge. The outer surface, 105.6, multiply that times 5, what do you get? Do you got a calculator on your phone?
I do.
Try that. Put in 105.6 and multiply times 5.
753.
You sure?
105. 105.6
times 5.
times
Tell me what you
5.
get.
528. Excuse me.
There we go. Yeah. 528. Multiplied by, what did you multiply that by?
5.
5. So if you multiply it by 50, you've got a mile.
Yep. Yep.
Is that a coincidence?
No.
And then the average distance between the big sarsen stone uprights, the lintel length, is also 10.56 feet. So it looks like they were using a unit of measurement that was a sub-multiple of a mile when they built Stonehenge 4,000 some years ago.
What is Stonehenge?
What is it? I think it's part of an ancient technology. And that's the only thing that makes sense to me. I think all of these ancient structures that are using this orientation to the heavens, that's what they've got in common. They have a common geometry, a common orientation. And there's another factor, too. It also seems that they're not located randomly. They're placed auspiciously with respect to the geometry. The work of, what was his name? I've interviewed him. If I'd had more than 4 hours of sleep in 2 days, I would be a little bit quicker on the ball here. It'll come to me. He's written a book. He's written a number of books on the geomantic principles behind the siting of these ancient structures, and he's documented hundreds of sites and shows to a high, more than is coincident, that they are located with respect to the geological structures, particularly fault lines in the earth, which opens up an interesting realm of possibilities because there's other research that suggests that
Frequency and vibration.
yes. And fault lines, a fault line is different, say, than just a fracture. A fracture, you've got a crack in the earth that's static. But a fault line, those rocks are moving with respect to each other under pressure. And that right there creates interesting possibilities in terms of the effects on the geomagnetic field. I'm in the infancy of trying to figure this out. There's other people who've gone further than this than I have, but I think it's part of the whole canon of principles that are employed in these ancient sacred structures. Number one, you get somebody out, and I'm a believer in geomancy. I've seen it work. In my building trades, I have seen what are called dowsers at work and seen major companies, government agencies, others that have actually almost secretly employed water dowsers and diviners to determine what. My first experience was in about 1974-75. I got hired to build a pole barn, and so the client had bought 15 used telephone poles that he had, and he called me and said, "Is there some way we can use these to build a barn?" I said, "Yeah, well, let's build a pole barn. We'll put the poles into the ground vertically, and then I'll just frame a structure onto this thing, I'll run purlins around to tie them all together. I can build a roof. I can finish it off, all of that." And he said, "Okay." So we had a building site there where I was going to build this barn. So back then you could call Ma Bell. This was the telephone company that handled North Georgia, right? You call them up and they would charge $8 a pole. They would send their auger truck out, they would drill the hole, and then they used their boom, and they would set the pole for you. It's a pretty good deal, $8. So we had 15 poles. So what I did was I went out, I figured out the layout of this, and every place I was going to have a pole, so I had it 3 rows of 5 each. That was the 15. And I remember they were, like 15 feet apart or something. Anyways, at each point where I wanted to put a pole, I drove a stake in the ground. So I had 15 stakes in 3 rows. Call Ma Bell, the phone company. Their auger truck comes out. There's 2 guys up in the front of the cab in their Ma Bell uniforms. And then in the back, this guy gets out. He's real tall, skinny guy. He might have been 6'5", 6'6". Overalls and an old wrinkled hat, carrying what looked like a violin case. Gets out of the back of the truck, comes walking down, looking the sight over. And these other 2 guys are standing up at the truck, waiting. And I'm going, okay, who's this guy? What's he doing? Well, so I'm standing aside there, while he comes out. He opens up his case, and he takes out 2 swing rods. Now, you know what swing rods are?
I don't.
Okay, so let me explain what a swing rod. Now, there's different ways you can make swing rods, right? What he had done was he had taken the old-fashioned automobile antennas and, the telescoping kind, and had a little ball on the end. And he had 2 of those, and he'd cut it off so that the larger outer sleeve was about maybe this long to where you could grip it. And then he bent it at 90 degrees, and so it was free to swivel. So he had 2 of those. They're referred to in the dowsing field as swing rods. Yeah, and I'm looking at him and going, what the hell is this? What the hell is he doing? And I'm looking up at these guys, and they were kind of like, I remember they were kind of chuckling or something, because I'm standing there, I got my tool belt on, and, I'm sure that they're not pulling my leg, But anyway, so he goes and he starts walking with the swing rods, holding them in front of him over each of the stakes I had driven in the ground. And as he walks, meanwhile, as he's walking, they're just kind of gently swaying back and forth. He steps over them, and as he'd step over each stake, he'd holler up to the guys at the truck, "Clear." He walked over all 15 of my stakes in the ground and said, "Clear." Now, between me and the main house, there was a garage building, and the driveway to the property came in and went to that garage building. And I knew that the water main came into the property somewhere along there, and it probably crossed the driveway to get to the house. So this guy, he goes walking over towards the driveway, and he gets about midway across the driveway. And I'm watching this whole time. I'm about as far away from him as, probably one end to the other of this room we're in. All of a sudden, it looked like almost as if somebody had grabbed the ends of those swing rods, yanked them into an X, and then they bent. They bent, like I could see him bending, literally bending down. And then he took a couple of steps off, and they relaxed, straightened up, and went back to just... Then what he did was he walked in a zigzag fashion, and every time he crossed where the water main came in, he'd get a response. And I could see it. I could see the response, and it was pretty impressive. And just then the owner comes out, and he says, yeah, I think the water main does come in right there. And I'm looking at it. This is fucking interesting. And then he turns to me and says, "You want to try it?" I look at the guys at the truck. Sure, why not? He gives me those swing rods, and I go walking. I stepped across that point, and I felt like I got, you know how you like if you get a strong charge of static electricity? Mm-hmm. That's what it felt like.
I've actually heard of this before.
Yeah, and it felt like somebody grabbed the ends of those rods and swung them into an X. Now, I've tried it since then, and I've gotten a response, but never like that first time. I mean, I don't know. I was caught off guard or something. And maybe it also had something to do with him being there, right? Now, since then, I've known probably half a dozen other people. I gave several lectures to the Appalachian Society of Dowsers back in the 90s, and I got to know a bunch of these people that were like literally like contracting out to building contractors, to other things, literally people who were paying them money. And, if you read the scientific literature, it's skeptical. They have these tests where statistically there's no indication that there's any greater effect of that. But I totally think it has to do that there's really subjective things going on here. Because, first of all, I've tried it a lot since then and gotten mild responses, but never anything like that first time, where it was shocking. It was actually shocking to me. But after that, I came to believe, yes, there are these energies, and humans can detect them. We know animals detect changes in the geomagnetic field. And why is it so incredible that moving water underground, or moving water in a fault line, or two mineral or crystalline deposits moving at each other couldn't create enough anomalies or fluctuations in the geomagnetic field that they could be detected? And if you have people now, and back, I knew guys, now I wasn't there, but I knew guys, friends of mine, or not friends of mine, but acquaintances of mine, that were Marines in Vietnam. And they used dowsers to find landmines. Now, they would not have done, you can look up even online, there's still photographs online of some of these guys. I heard about it, this was years and years ago. I think I was telling people, I had a friend who was my neighbor who was an ex-Marine, and I was telling him this story. He was my neighbor at the time this happened. And he said, oh yeah, we had guys in Vietnam that would use those to find underground tunnels, find landmines, and and I've looked up online since then. You can actually see the pictures of these guys. So, my thought was, okay, they would not be using this if it was just all BS. There's something to it. Now, circling around, I think these ancient builders were using something similar to determine, for example, when they put that pole in the ground, it wasn't just placed randomly. Mm-hmm. For example, you can look at some of the temples, like Chartres Cathedral is a good example, which I highly recommend, Chartres Cathedral. There's a series of fault lines that intersect directly under the holy altar. And you can go down, there's a crypt down below the altar you can go into, and there's a well. And you can see right down into the well the water table. Now, here's another interesting coincidence. If you take that flagstone pavement, which is the floor when you walk into the cathedral, the height of the vault, it's roughly around 120 feet above the paving stones of the floor, is the same distance above as the water table is below. Is that a coincidence again? See, these kind of things, you can multiply them over and over and over again. And you get to the point, well, okay, so maybe we should hypothesize that there's a method to this madness. Mm-hmm. I can't say that I know what it is. I think, maybe we can recover. I mean, what I'm interested in doing is, and there's people, like I mentioned, Robert Edward Grant and others that I know. I think we're kind of in this phase right now where it's essentially trying to reverse engineer what these peoples of long ago were up to with all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And I ultimately think it's technological.
It's fascinating stuff, isn't it?
Isn't it, though?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I got pictures I could pull up and show you right here of my 15 poles. Took pictures of it.
We'll get them from you and put them up on screen. I mean, that brings us into, I think, plasma technology.
Yeah.
Lightning bolt technology.
Yeah.
Well, what is it?
Lightning bolts, that's plasma. Ball lightning, the sun is plasma, right? Aurora borealis, the northern lights, is plasma. It's the fourth state of matter. It's what happens when the electrons and the neutrons become completely disassociated. Solid, liquid, gas, degrees of freedom between electrons and neutrons, right? Even in a gas, there's still bonds. But when you get to plasma, they completely break free. So now you have electrons, neutrons become ions, and because they're electrically charged, they can be influenced by magnetic fields. And they also have this tendency to self-organize under the right conditions. If you apply the right frequency, it's like they spontaneously organize into toroidal forms. And then what happens is that, if you look at a torus in cross-section, it looks like an infinity sign. But picture kind of a donut. Here's what you do. Visualize a sphere with a north pole and a south pole. And now let's say you collapse that sphere so that the north pole and the south pole meet at the equator. So now you've got this like indentation in the north and the south. Well,
like
what
two
happens?
cones.
Yeah, like cones. They're like cones, right? Well, what happens, and I'm rudimentary in understanding this, right? But what then happens is that you get this electron or ion or both stream that starts cycling down that what do you want to call it? What did you just call it?
Cone.
A what?
Cone.
Cone.
Like a funnel.
Starts slightly, perfect. Starts spiraling down that funnel, and as it's spiraling down, it's increasing and increasing in rotational velocity. Now, in the northern hemisphere, say, it's going clockwise, and in the southern, it's going counterclockwise. And they meet at the equatorial plane. And that's where something really interesting happens that I don't understand. But you've got this accelerating rotation, faster and faster, coming down literally to the microscopic level. And then those two whirling vortices meet each other. Something happens there that's almost supernatural. And I can't claim to know what it is. But that's the basis of the plasma technology. And that creates, in the machines that are being developed, they work by generating microscopic cavitation bubbles. And then those cavitation bubbles are subject to very rapid vacuum and pressure, because if they're fed into, like, say, a generator or a combustion fossil fuel-based any engine of any kind, where you've got pistons moving up and down, the movement down will create a compression phase, and then the moving up will create a vacuum phase. And what will happen is the microscopic bubbles, the cavitation bubbles, collapse on their axes. They form these perfect toruses that now initiate this self-organization process of the plasmoids. And they can now be harvested from that machine that's creating these bubbles. And then they're fed into a series of tubes and cylinders and spheres that are carefully machined to very specific and precise ratios. And it's, for example, one end you've got a sphere with an opening in it, and the plasmas are fed into that under high pressure, and in that sphere, they start whirling. And there's a thing that's, and I'm still trying to understand how it works, the Hilch vortex tube, which can actually create two vortices, one whirling one way, and then another one inside it whirling the other way. And it can actually separate. You can feed in air at room temperature, and it separates that into a hot and cold end. And that differential can be up to a couple of 100 degrees difference. Again, we can pull up, and I can provide you with the graphics and stuff to help understand this. The thunderstorm generator, so-called, works on the same principle. Except what it does is it has a cylinder that's within a cylinder within a cylinder. a sphere within a sphere within a sphere. Now, here's where it gets interesting, is because, okay, you feed the plasmas in, they start this whirling. And one vortex whirls down one direction, the other is fed in, it whirls in the other direction, and then they're both fed back to where they meet. So you've got this cold and this hot front meeting. That's why it's called a thunderstorm, because it's operating on the same principle as like a cold front. And then, like cold, what happens? So the cold front meets a hot front or a warm front, and it begins discharging lightning. It starts discharging plasmas, right? So this thunderstorm generator can now be hooked up to any kind of internal combustion engine, to a generator, and something really bizarre happens. And I was reluctant to talk about it. You know, I went on Rogan's show with Graham Hancock a year ago last November. And I had already been in contact with Malcolm, one of the preeminent inventors and developers of technological applications of plasmas. I hadn't decided yet whether he was for real or not. But I'd been talking to him distance for over 7 years, and his story never changed. Right? And I took careful note of that, and I began looking at some of the things that he claimed as sources, and they all checked out. Going back to Nikola Tesla, right? Coming up through like half a dozen other researchers that had worked in some capacity trying to develop technologies around this plasma energy, like learning how to contain plasma and then extract energy from it. So then, and I'm not going to get into all the details because it's a pretty wild story, but
I love the details.
I know, but I'm like, okay, so I go on Rogan with Graham Hancock, and Graham invited me to go on with him. We'd been on there before multiple times, and I had, you know, when Graham was researching his books and stuff, in at least one case, I'd been out in the field with him at least a couple of times, guiding him and showing him evidence in the landscape for these tremendous catastrophic events, which he then documents like in the book Magicians of the Gods. I think there's 2 chapters in there devoted to our travels together and the things that I was showing him. Well, anyways, before we go in, he says, you know, because, you know, Graham has been attacked left and right by the mainstream guys, the archaeological establishment and all. He says, let's not get into talking about ancient technology. Okay, if you don't want to, I'm fine. I'm happy to talk about mass extinctions or giant floods or asteroid impacts or whatever. I'm sure, yeah. Well, then the issue came up of the ancient builders and how they moved 200-ton stones. So Joe is like, well, did they have some technological means? And if you go back and watch that November show from, like, they kind of like both look at me. Well, wait a minute now. Like, I'm thinking, I just said I was not going to talk about that, right? So I was evasive. But Joe, you can like, you'll see, like, I'm trying to not talk about it. And Joe, no, well, come on, what do you know? So I mentioned that, well, I'd been talking to this inventor for about 7 years, and he's been developing these technologies using plasma, and it's frequency-based, right? And at this point, I already knew that the thunderstorm generator, and I'll show you pictures of one now that's been retrofitted on a 300-kilowatt generator on a substation outside of London. And they're testing the damn thing. And it works. It does what it's predicted to do, right? I mentioned that he was on an island where he'd gone because there had actually been a couple of attempts on his life. So he was an oil prospector. And he discovered oil in Tasmania, and one of the big oil companies was trying to wrest the license away from him. So they did a whole smear job against him, started paying off journalists and Tasmanian government officials and stuff and trying to create, you know, portray him as a grifter and all this to scare away investors, because they this company had overstated their reserves by about 30%, and they were going to get in some major trouble. And they did get in major trouble. In 2003, the entire board of this company resigned. And I've double-checked that. Now, one of the things is leading up to this, when I'm still like, okay, should I be believing all of this? Well, let me, before I jump to that, so I kind of outed the guy inadvertently, because he had told me that because of what the history of these kind of alternative energies not making it out, he decided he was going to use a different strategy. He was going to open source everything. All of his notes, and he had spent 7 years writing up his notes, several thousand pages of notes and schematics and diagrams. He had patent applications. All of this he was going to open source. And he asked me, because he had no connections, and I had already was building up quite an audience, and he asked me, when he first called me, he told me this. He said, I've been working on this plasma energy, and it's based on frequencies, and these frequencies are connected to these ancient sacred numbers. And he said, I watched a podcast, and it was you giving a lecture, and you were talking about ancient numbers, and the numbers you were mentioning were exactly the numbers that I found made this technology work. For example, the ratios of the spheres have to be in the ratio 4 to 3 to 2. And if they weren't in those proper ratios, you didn't get the effect, right? So he's telling me all of this and said, the reason I'm reaching out to you is because I'm thinking you're probably one of the only people in the world I can talk to about what I'm doing. Well, I'm honored if this is all real. Well, so after I'm on Rogan, I outed him. Now, he was off traveling somewhere, and he got so freaked out, he never went back to his laboratory. He came right over to America. And I was scheduled. Now, this would have been November, a year ago, November. So I also mentioned the car manufacturer Mazda, who had expressed interest in the technology. Now, I don't think they've gone forward with it, but at the time, I didn't realize, because I thought he'd given me the green light. I'm going to open source it, so, I'm going to put it all out there.
Yeah.
Okay, so turns out that he had and his small group of potential investors had signed a non-disclosure agreement with Mazda. And here I am on Joe Rogan shooting my big mouth off, innocently blabbing away. So, the next day, within a day or two, I get a call from Roland Perry, who was probably Australia's best-selling author, and he's also an investigative reporter and has some pretty high-level connections with Australian intelligence and so on. I get a call from this guy, and he's telling me, well, you just outed Malcolm, but it's cool. It's going to be okay, because don't get freaked out, So one of the high-ups, a guy who was with fellow who has a international passport with World Bank. He was one of the people who were involved in looking at this technology. I didn't realize this. He had jumped on a flight and immediately went to Japan to do damage control from me shooting my big mouth off. But it turned out okay, I guess, because within a few days their stock went up.
Very interesting.
Yeah. But so he came to America. I had scheduled to go down to do an interview with Tucker Carlson. So I went down to his studio in Florida, Boca Grande, just south of Sarasota. I was in the hotel there, and the inventor shows up, Malcolm, he shows up. So I stayed a few extra days. We went through a lot of stuff. I left, went back to Atlanta. He stayed on. It turned out he went and got a room in a beachfront resort. And it turned out the manager of the place was a Randall Carlson fan. So he gave Malcolm the run of the place. And a lot of it, they had a restaurant and all this there that had closed down during COVID. So he gave Malcolm the keys, said, use it for whatever you want. So we set up like a mini podcast studio in there. And we then had an interview with a man by the name of Com Carpenter, who is the founder of the India Foundation, which is a liaison between the French government and the Indian government. So we had this interview with him. He took this information to the Indian government, and they were very interested in it. So now I'm going to skip some of the details, but fast forward to last summer. Now, okay, so Joe asked me to come back on to talk about the technology. So we agreed that I would come back in February. And then, so I went back on Joe's show, but Malcolm the inventor was here in America, and he came up to Atlanta to tutor me in the technology. So we put together a big slideshow, over 200 slides, which I have right here on mine. And then he gave a series of lectures. As he then went through the slides, he gave lectures on that. And so then I had this invitation to go back on Joe's to talk about the technology. Well, here I had the inventor right here with me, so I contacted Joe and I said, I've got the inventor with me. You want to bring him on? He said, sure. So myself, him, George Howard, who I mentioned earlier, runs the Cosmic Tusk website and so on. He went with a couple of other friends that went with. We drove down there, and I went in there, and myself and Malcolm sat down, and Jamie had found this stuff from the 90s and the early 2000s online, where it goes back to this controversy where they were trying to get the license away from Malcolm.
Interesting.
So it was basically a series of hit pieces that I'd had this conversation with Roland Perry he called me, we had this long conversation, and he said, yeah, I spent 4 years investigating Malcolm. So all the stuff he's telling you is real, and I've seen the technology work. Okay, and I knew it was Roland Perry. I mean, he sent me links, and, I watched videos that he was on. So that boosted my confidence quite a bit that this was all real. But basically what happened was I had this slideshow we had put together, and this paperwork Jamie puts on. So Joe was looking at this stuff when we just walk in. Now, he knows nothing about any of this except what he's seeing is that, trying to portray Malcolm as a religious nut and a bunch of other weird stuff that I'd already seen, and I'd talked about it with Roland Perry, and he said, yeah, this was all part of this smear campaign, just like they've done with Graham Hancock, just like they've done with all these people. You try to discredit them. But the key here is this. Even if all that was true, which it isn't, but even if it was, the technology works. His invention works, okay? So we went on the show, and Joe, saw this stuff and thought, okay, who is this guy that Randall's brought in here? He's a grifter. So it got contentious. And if it ever airs, you'll see me constantly trying to steer the conversation. I've got the slideshow open there. I'm saying, come on, guys, let's look at the science here. Yeah. But they were going at each other. And when it was over, we go out, and Joe calls me aside and says, hey. And the thing is by the end of this, I'm thinking, people are going to go, oh, gosh, Randall is, promoting this grifter. He's promoting this con man. And I'm thinking, oh, shit, I'm already thinking about the ramifications of this. And I'm going, man, this is going to throw serious upheaval in my life. And then Joe calls me to the side as we're going out, and he says, hey, be okay with you if I sat on this for a while I figure out? And I said, it was like, yeah, sit on as long as you want. And so it never has It never has aired, which is fine with me because it got so off track, and I wanted to stick to the science. Now, I knew at the time, this is February, a year ago last month, I knew that there was a whole series of testing coming up the next summer, which was last summer. And I was present at some of these tests and saw for myself what was happening and was able to, there with an admiral, a retired admiral from the Indian Navy, flew all the way over from India to be there present at this testing that was at a major industrial laboratory at one of the research labs out in Raleigh, North Carolina. That's all at this point that I can say about it, but until the final test results are published. But I was there, saw it working, saw 2 generators, a control generator, and one with the technology. I watched as the engineers and the scientists there calibrated them both. And then I was the one who went up and started both generators. They're both in 2 separate rooms. Started the technology on one of the generators. And so we've got readouts. We've got gas analyzers there, probes going up into the exhausts of the generators. We've got a couple of guys there with mass spectrometers hooked up. So we've got multiple ways of determining what's coming out of the exhaust pipes of these 2 generators, right?
Yeah.
I go up there and I flip the switch on the one that has the thunderstorm, I'll call it the thunderstorm, the plasma generating retrofit to it. And we watch. So we got a first read. I can show you, actually. I've got a printout of the readouts right here on my computer.
Really?
Yeah, I do. And you can see you've got, I think it's called a Kane 5 something because it measures 5 gases. Carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide, other methane, other hydrocarbons, probably like methane and whatever else, and oxygen. Okay, so flip the technology on. You can sit there, I can watch the mass spectrometer, I can watch the gas analyzer. You're looking at like 10% or parts per million. Let's see. Carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and oxygen were in percentages. Methane and nitrogen oxide were in parts per million. So basically, oxygen is like at a 4 or 5% coming out of the exhaust, which is about typical for a generator like that. You got, I think, like 10, 11 was it 12% of CO2, CO, etc. So as you're watching it, here's what happens. The carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, hydrocarbons, and nitrogen oxides start going down. Oxygen starts coming up.
Interesting.
CO2 zeroes out. Carbon monoxide zeroes out. The nitrogen oxides go down to just a few parts per million, as does the other hydrocarbons. Oxygen tops out at over 20, I don't remember exactly, between 20 and 21%, which is optimum percentage of oxygen for pure unpolluted air. So what is now coming out of the generator, the generator with the technology, is pure unpolluted air.
No kidding.
No kidding. No
Whoa.
kidding. Yeah. On top of that, what it's doing, it's capturing everything that's coming out, and it's feeding it back into the thunderstorm generator. So at the initial, in order to get the plasma separation to occur, I think you have to get it up to like 700 and some degrees. But once you do that, it's almost, not quite, but almost self-perpetuating. And you just have to replenish the water. Like I forget, however few hundred hours that it runs, you have to replenish the water. And that's it.
Man, and you've seen this.
Oh, yeah, I've seen it. And I've known, multiple people now that have seen it. The admiral, he took it back to India. India is seriously looking at it and as a retrofit for their Navy.
Man.
the industrial, and I can show you this on the computer too. I've got photographs of like the big industrial scale application on the 300 kilowatt Perkins generator on the substation in London. I mean, they're testing it, and they may start retrofitting all of their because it doubles to triples the efficiency of these engines.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And you think that they had this back in ancient times?
Some iteration of it, I suspect. And here, now, it just gets more bizarre as we go on. When you create these vortexes, you start this spiral motion inside the sphere, and then it travels down. So you got an outer cylinder and an inner cylinder. And one vortex is inside the outer, but outside the inner. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Then the next vortex going in the opposite direction and the opposite spin is inside the next cylinder.
Okay.
Now, in order to transition from, and again, and I can show you this on here because I got photographs of all the components, how they fit together, videos of them being assembled in the machine shops right here on this laptop, so you can see it. You can't, like if you have a sphere and you just cut a round hole in it and you stick a cylinder onto it, it's got this like sharp edge, and that would induce turbulence that would affect this coherent, organized vortex that forms. So you have to have a transition between the cylinder and the sphere to prevent that turbulence from being introduced. Experimentation has shown that one angle seems to be optimum for minimizing the introduction of the turbulence. What do you think that angle is?
I don't know.
51.84 degrees. Slope to base of Khufu's pyramid. Another coincidence? I don't know. But that leads me to think, okay, I've suspected all along that these pyramids and these structures are part of an ancient technological system, probably somewhat along the lines of the principles of Nikola Tesla, right? Who was able to generate energy by setting up some kind of a relationship between the Earth and the ionosphere. I don't know what's going on there. I'm still trying to figure out. Listen, I was in kindergarten 2 years ago. Now I'm in first grade. But when I was there at this testing, I'm seeing these scientists, physicists and engineers and stuff, they're all scratching their heads, going, okay, we see this, but they've been struggling for a year now to explain what is actually happening. There's a fellow by the name of Bob Grenier, who I think has probably come as close as anybody. He's head of the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project. Martin Fleischmann was one of the pioneers in these alternative energies, particularly working with plasma. Brilliant mind. He came on board about a year ago. And he was there was a Tesla Tech conference in last summer in Albuquerque. And my pal and partner in HowTube.com did the live streaming out to, I don't know, a couple of thousand people around the world that paid to be able to witness. And what they did in front of a live audience on a stage is they brought in a generator and retrofitted it right there. And as a result of that, several things happened. From there, it went to this research lab in North Carolina. From there, it went to a conference in Zurich where it was presented. Malcolm then went and spent 2 months in India demonstrating and building prototypes. And so, I mean, this is the phase where it's at now. Let's see, what else?
So they're really looking at this.
What?
People are really paying attention to this.
People are starting to pay attention to this. Yeah, that's exactly right. So there's a really interesting video that I would recommend watching. It's an interview with the gentleman is named George Lush. He works in high performance metals. He contracts. He's third generation. Their company, I think, was founded in 1951. He's contracts to the aerospace industry and NASA and all of this, these high performance alloys and stuff. And he did the annealing of this thunderstorm generator in England. And there's an interview, like a 20-minute interview with him afterwards. And it's really worth watching because he says, I'm the biggest skeptic around. And what I saw can't happen. What I saw is impossible, but I saw it. He's there with his, he had a thermal analyzer. And we've got videos of him here and there testing as this stream of stuff is moving through these cylinders and pipes and stuff. And literally with 4 inches, the temperature can change by over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And he says, this is impossible. He says, I kept testing and testing and testing with my thermal analyzer, and it came up the same every time. He says, I'm not sure what, he says, we're just at the beginning of trying to figure out what the hell is happening here. But then he went in to discuss the potential applications of it. Now, one of the big questions is okay, when you do look at these readouts, okay, carbon dioxide, the other things go down. In some cases, zero out. In other cases, it doesn't zero out entirely, but it's only a small fraction of what it had been. Meanwhile, the oxygen's gone up. So then the question, okay, where did the carbon dioxide go? Where did the carbon monoxide go? Well, it looks like it somehow got transmuted on the atomic level into oxygen. And how bizarre that the concentration of oxygen coming out of the exhaust pipes is the optimum oxygen that we would want for unpolluted, breathable air. And that's what's coming out.
Man, that is...
And George Howard was there. I watched him do this. He got down with his mouth right there and started huffing the plasmoids or whatever coming out, to show, yeah. He did the same thing at the Tesla Tech conference in Albuquerque. We've got it on video, him getting down there and huffing. It's a running joke now, that he got down there and was... And they initially started up the generator on the stage, and once the generator got warmed up, the fumes coming out got so strong that they had to move the generator out onto the loading dock. Then they turned the technology on, and within a few minutes, instead of all this pollutant and stuff coming out, it's air.
Man.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to lay it all on you, Nancy. I'll give you the links. You can go and there's a fella in Australia, a young guy doing research named Jordan Collins. Jordan Collins. He's called his website's called Alchemical Science. He's done a really great breakdown and analysis of the whole thing, and he's got ideas about what he thinks how it's working. But he's been actually in contact with Roland Perry. There's a video that you can also get. I'll give you the link that you can. It was made about 5 years ago where they first did a retrofit of a car, retrofitting an internal combustion engine. And Roland Perry is there interviewing the 2 mechanics who had just completed the retrofit. And it's not a big deal at all. And then he's test driving the car at the end of it. So Jordan Collins, who's also in Australia, goes down and met Roland Perry in the machine shop where they did this, and they're talking about the car. It's been sitting there for a number of years now, but talking about how, what would be involved in retrofitting lots of cars. George Lush, the annealer, the high performance metal guy, he in the end of his interview, he talks about the potential application. He says, well, think about this. If you put this technology on cars, you got billions of cars all over the world. You got hundreds of thousands of cars driving down city streets. And they're putting out all of this stuff, right? With this technology, They're putting out air.
Yeah.
Putting out air.
That would eliminate fossil fuels.
Almost, but not quite. Fossil fuels would have them. But see, at this point, they're using fossil fuels to get those initial temperatures to set the whole process in motion. But there's other applications that look like they could be. I mean, some of the stuff that I've seen some of these guys talking about is space travel, submarines, possibly even the conversion of hydrocarbon-based pollution in oceans into protein, which could be very interesting.
Yeah.
And I don't know much about that, but that's one of the potential applications that's already been demonstrated to be possible. So, like I said, I'm still in first grade. Maybe I'm about to graduate to second grade, but I've got a lot to learn yet. So, we can carry on this conversation. And if you're interested in keeping up with the developments, man, I'd love to keep you in the loop.
Yeah, I would love to.
It's exciting.
I would love to hear more about it.
Yeah.
On that note, let's take a quick break.
Okay.
Today's show is brought to you by HelixSleep.com. Sleep, especially as you get older, is so critical, especially that deep, comforting sleep. Go to HelixSleep.com and take the sleep quiz. I took it, and I was matched to the Midnight Lux. I've always struggled to get a full night's sleep. After years of operating overseas, some days my back is just absolutely shot. But not anymore. I've had Helix Sleep Mattress for over a year now, and it leaves me feeling refreshed and ready for the day every day. Plus, their enhanced cooling features keep me cool all night long. Helix knows that everyone's unique, so they have several different mattress models to match based on your body type and sleep preferences. Once you match, your mattress comes right to your door, shipped for free. Helix has a 10-year warranty and even has financing options for flexible payment plans. So a great night's sleep is never far away. Helix is offering 20% off all mattress orders and 2 free pillows for our listeners. Go to helixsleep.com/SRS and use the code HelixPartner20. This is their best offer yet, and it won't last long. With Helix, better sleep starts now.
I want to tell you about this business venture I've been on for about the past 7-8 months, and it's finally come to fruition. I've been hell-bent on finding the cleanest functional mushroom supplement on the planet, and that all kind of stemmed from this psychedelic treatment I did. Came out of it, got a ton of benefits, haven't had a drop of alcohol in almost 2 years. I'm more in the moment with my family, and that led me down researching the benefits of just everyday functional mushrooms. And I started taking some supplements, I found some coffee replacements, I even repped a brand. And, it got to the point where I just wanted the finest ingredients available, no matter where they come from. And it got to this point where I was just going to start my own brand. And so we started going to trade shows and looking for the finest ingredients. And in doing that, I ran into this guy, maybe you've heard of him. His name's Laird Hamilton, and his wife, Gabby Reese, and they have an entire line of supplements with all the finest ingredients. And we got to talking. Turns out they have the perfect functional mushroom supplement. It's actually called Performance Mushrooms. And this has everything. It's USDA organic. It's got chaga, cordyceps, lion's mane, maitake. This stuff is amazing for energy balance, for cognition. Look, just being honest, see a lot of people taking care of their bodies. I do not see a lot of people taking care of their brain. This is the product, guys. And so we got to talking, and our values seemed very aligned. We're both into the functional mushrooms. And after a lot of back and forth, I am now a shareholder in the company. I have a small amount of ownership, and I'm just really proud to be repping and be a part of the company that's making the best functional mushroom supplement on the planet. You can get this stuff at Laird Superfoods. superfoods.com. You can use the promo code SRS. That'll get you 20% off these performance mushrooms or anything in the store. They got a ton of good stuff. Once again, that's lairdsuperfoods.com. Use the promo code SRS. That gets you 20% off. You guys are going to love this stuff. I guarantee it.
You've heard me talk about my passion for ketone supplements and how they boost your workouts by helping your body use fatty acids for fuel. I take a shot of HVMN's ketone supplement before my morning workout and before I record my show. It's not an energy drink, but what it does do is it gives me the energy and the clarity that I need to get through my day. I don't drink coffee, so this is my go-to when I need that edge. Ketone IQ comes in convenient shots and are great for workouts or when you need to be in the zone. Some of the world's best athletes rely on this to improve their performance because it doesn't contain sugar or caffeine, but it gives them the same benefits. I wish I had this when I was on active duty. I have more endurance, I don't get the crash, and it helps curb my appetite when I'm doing a long day of interviews without a food break. Folks, HVMN is offering my audience 30% off your first subscription order of Ketone IQ at hvmn.com/Shawn. Again, visit hvmn.com/Shawn and subscribe upon checkout for 30% off. Find Ketone IQ in your local Sprouts or Earth Bar stores nationwide. All right, Randall, I got a couple of questions, and you showed me a couple of slides off camera here.
Yes, I did.
Why don't we just start with the clean energy, the clean emissions? You had a great slide that showed what.
Yes, I did. Well, this was part of the testing that was done last summer. There's been 4 or 5 tests now that have been done showing various results. And the slide that I showed you was last summer. It was a generator. It should be right about, well, where is it? Should be right about here, just about coming up. And what this did, here we go. So this was a generator. This generator here was a Honda run by a gasoline generator. So it's a Honda jet, small, the kind you could actually use in a small shop or even as a home generator, right? Now, so what we did was we had 2 rooms with 2 generators. One to be left normal and the other one to be retrofitted with the plasma technology, right? So this is in a large scale, and this is in an industrial laboratory, right? There's about 10 or 12 people there, various backgrounds, scientific and engineering and industry professionals in the group, including me. I was there. I got invited out, so hell yeah, I want to see this thing, because a lot of people have said to me, well, have you ever seen this working? I said, well, no, but I know some credible people that have seen it working and vouch for it, but yeah, so I'm going to go, I want to see it for myself. So went out there. So they ran both generators, calibrated them, looked at the emissions coming out of them, calibrated them. They were essentially the same. And then one of them was retrofitted with the technology, right? So with everybody standing around, turned both generators on, and got to let the generators warm up a minute, right? And then once the generators are warm, the one generator, which had the technology on it, there's a switch to turn the technology on, and it just run in line with the exhaust and the carburetor. And, I can provide you with a slide with some diagrams that shows you the hookup of the thing. It's actually pretty simple. Okay, so I flipped the switch to turn the technology on. And I flipped the switch at 11 minutes and 53 seconds after 10 a.m. in the morning. Okay, so now at this point, we've got a gas analyzer in both generators, and we've got mass spectrometers hooked up to both generators. So, the guys are sitting there with their mass spectrometers. You could see the changing real time. I could watch there on the computer screen, right? So when I turned the technology on, there was and it's called a Kane. Let's see, what is it? Kane 5 analyzer, something. Because it can measure concentrations of 5 different gases. So you got carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, oxygen, other hydrocarbons, which probably is mainly methane, but then also nitrogen oxide. So those 5, right? So carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and oxygen are being measured in percentage. And hydrocarbons and nitrous oxides are measured in parts per million. Okay, so now at the point where we're about ready to turn the technology on, the emissions are showing that 9.3% coming out of the exhaust is carbon dioxide, 9.3%. Carbon monoxide is showing 5.48%. Oxygen is showing 4.66%. Hydrocarbons, 199 parts per million. And nitrogen oxides, 27 parts per million. This is at 11 minutes and 53 seconds after 10 o'clock. Flip the switch. Technology now activates. At 15 minutes and 39 seconds after 10 o'clock, what's coming out, and you've seen this now, so I'm describing, but you've seen it here, and this is the actual printout right from the testing. At 15 minutes after 10 o'clock, carbon dioxide has gone from 9.3% to 0. Carbon monoxide has gone from 5.48% to 0. Hydrocarbons have gone from 199 parts per million to 58 parts per million. And nitrous oxides have gone from 27 parts per million to 4 parts per million. And oxygen has gone from 4.66% to 20.97%.
Interesting. So this is clean.
So don't ask me to explain what's gone on here, other than something on the atomic level. There's some thoughts out there that essentially what we're seeing here is almost like proof of alchemy. We're seeing transmutation, and I'm not making definitive declaration that this is what it is. It's just what it appears to be, that there's a transmutation of elements on the atomic level. Because the question becomes, okay, if you had 9.3% carbon dioxide, 0, what happened to the carbon dioxide? What happened to the carbon monoxide? They're gone. They're gone. Well, where did all that extra oxygen come? We're talking about, let's see, from 4.66% to 20.97%. So almost 5 times the concentration of oxygen is now coming out of that exhaust. Is it possible? I mean, is it even conceivable that somehow the carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, hydrocarbons, nitrous oxides were broken down at the atomic level and transmuted into oxygen? I don't know. And I know there's a lot of really smart people who are right now trying to figure out what the fuck this means.
So, wow.
Now,
How is this hooked up to the generators?
well, you've got an intake of fresh air, and then it's recycling. It's taking the stuff that would be exhausted and refeeding it back into the thunderstorm generator, which is one of the 3 components of the whole technology. You've got a pre-ionization chamber where the air is drawn in, just ambient air is drawn into this chamber, and it's subjected to infrared light at roughly 100 microns, right? It pre-excites the electrons in the atoms coming in. It is then fed into what is called, we're calling the bubbler. And this is the instrument where billions of microscopic bubbles are created. That's fed into the thunderstorm generator, where I was describing earlier is a series of concentric spheres and rings that set up this vortex, this whirling vortex in opposite, from clockwise to counterclockwise. And when we, if you get me back, we can figure out a way to like share some graphics and images so people can see at home. And what I'm interested in is getting a lot of minds on this, because I think the more brains we've got on this, sooner we're going to be able to figure out what the hell is going on here. So I mean, we can hook this thing up, we can run the tests, we can see the results of the tests, and now you got like 10 guys standing there with various backgrounds, scientific backgrounds, engineering backgrounds, industry professionals, all scratching their heads going, okay, what the hell is going on here?
I'm getting a little confused. Is this powering the generators or cleaning the emissions?
Both.
Or both?
Both. Yeah. But it does, so it requires fossil fuels initially, because in order to generate the plasmas in the first place, I think it's like 700 and some degrees. But then once the process is started, it's almost, not quite, but it's almost self-perpetuating. Almost.
Wow.
And I think, I would recommend, like I showed you, Alchemical Science. Jordan Collin has done a really good, and he's ahead of me on this one, because he's been able to focus almost full time for the last 4 to 6 months on this. So he's got some really interesting ideas, and he's also been communicating with the inventor Malcolm Bendel prolifically. So he's got some interesting ideas about what's going on, and I would recommend going to his site, Alchemical Science, and watching. He's got like 6 or 7 or 8 videos now he's done, where he's really breaking it down and explaining what he thinks is going on. Then there's others. I would recommend strikefoundation.earth has got video clips up there, and that's the nonprofit organization that was created to try to put this technology out to the world. Now, there are several patents that have actually, I think, been approved now, applications of the technology. But I kind of look at this almost as analogous to, 120, 130 years ago where we were with alternating current electricity. If you go back and read the history of alternating current electricity, you had a bunch of scientists, inventors, and engineers all scratching their heads trying to figure out, how does this work, right? And I don't think we still ultimately don't know what it is and how it works, but we know how to apply it to all kinds of different things. And I think that this is sort of analogous to that, in that there's all kinds of potential here. Malcolm and his small team through Alpha Prospects Limited, which is a website people can go to also learn about it, have applied and I think now received, the last I heard, or they were about to get approved for several patents. But all the rest of it, the basic principles, are open sourced on the web. So Jordan Collins has gotten with a small group of, I'd say, like backyard mechanics that are like going to do a whole series of internal combustion engine retrofits. And there's guys now who are, as we speak, like retrofitting their pickup trucks, right, to see if it works. And now the technology was presented at the Tesla Tech conference in Albuquerque. It was presented at a alternative energy technology conference in Zurich, Switzerland. And now, like we talked about earlier, the Indian Navy is very interested in looking at it. And Malcolm has spent a couple of months in India demonstrating the technology and how it works. One of his colleagues, Phil Dubois, but still there. They've been there about 3 months now, consulting with the Indian government. Now, here's the interesting thing. If you read the Vedas, the Vedic literature, there's all kinds of descriptions of stuff in there that sounds very technological. Like, you ever heard of the Vimana?
I haven't.
Okay, so the Vimana is in the Vedas, it describes, I think it's the Rig Veda, but in some of the Vedas, it's describing the Vimana, and it is a flying machine. That's what it's describing. The Vimana is a flying machine. Look it up on your phone right now, and you'll see, The other thing is the Vajra, and you see these depictions of the great king god Indra wielding the Vajra. right? And then this is like from 4,000 and 5,000 years ago in Vedic India, right? Then fast forward to like 3,000 years ago, roughly, and you see the god Mitra in Persia wielding the Vajra. Then fast forward about another 1,000 years, and in Greece you see Zeus wielding the Vajra. It's called the thunderbolt. Zeus wielding the thunderbolt. Then you can see Roman times the god Mithras wielding the thunderbolt. Well, you look at what they're wielding, and it's pretty much all the same instrument. And it was described as the most powerful instrument in the universe. And when you look at the depictions, and next time I come back on, I can show you this. I'll have images and graphics of replicas of the Vajra. Now, the Vajra, still to this day, there are replicas that are probably duplicates of things that were thousands of artifacts that were found that are thousands of years old. This is a replica of the Vajra. Well, when you look at that and you look at the components of the thunderstorm generator, you go, oh, okay,
Interesting.
And I can show you the correlations when I come back. Now,
How's this been received at all these summits that it was presented to in the Indian Navy?
well, the last I've heard, the Indian Navy is seriously looking at it for retrofitting ships. I haven't gotten the latest, but the one result of the demonstration out in the Tesla Tech conference last summer in Albuquerque, Mike Robertson, who's the founder of HowTube, which I've partnered with, he live streamed out to like several thousand people around the world. There was also an audience. They did this up on stage, up in an audience of several hundred people seeing it firsthand. They took the generator and retrofitted it on stage, videoed the whole thing, and podcasted out to the world. So as a result of that, Malcolm got invited to this conference in Zurich, Switzerland. So he presented there. Now, at the Tesla Tech conference in Albuquerque, he ended up being sort of the star presenter at the conference. And he was just like last minute. They brought him on, and then he ended up being the star presenter at the thing. And it's all on record now. It's all videotaped. Anybody can track these down. And on my website, I'll have all the links and stuff. But I think Jordan Collin at Alchemical Science already has the links up, so people can go and they can see those videos for themselves. And the idea now is to get it out. So, there's been a whole succession of inventors and scientists that have been working directly or peripherally in this field with this type of energy. And their work has been stolen, locked up, suppressed, classified. The strategy now is get it out there. Open source, so anybody can access it. Decide for yourself whether it's legit. I'd say don't make up your mind beforehand or until you've looked into it. A lot of people say, oh, this is bullshit, without having taken 2 seconds to look into it.
Yeah.
Well, this is impossible. What you're describing is impossible. Well, I got, a dozen scientists, engineers, industry professionals that say, yeah, it's impossible, but God damn it, we saw it. We saw it.
Yeah.
And they're still trying to figure out what exactly they saw.
Man, this is fascinating stuff.
It is. I agree.
Doesn't even seem real, but
I know.
There it is.
But it looks like there's going to be a major part of the Cosmic Summit in June. So far, both Malcolm Bendel, the inventor, and Jordan Collin are scheduled to be there.
Really?
Yes.
Where is that?
I think it's Greensboro, North Carolina.
What's the date?
It's like around the middle of June.
Okay.
I can let you know the exact dates. I mean, you could easily look it up online right now if you pulled out your phone, put in Cosmic Summit 2024, and it'll pop right up.
We'll link it.
Yeah.
And
anybody else is interested. I mean, this is This is one of the most interesting gathering of minds, I think, that's happening anywhere. There's a lot of interesting things happening, conferences, that in my mind kind of too heavy on the woo-woo. Mm-hmm. This is solid stuff. And I mean, we got everything from, independent researchers who by the mainstream might be considered fringe, but we've also got mainstream scientists who have been working on all the things we were talking about earlier. We've got several specialists in impact geology and astronomers that are going to be there speaking about it. Chandra Wickramasinghe, who is a astrophysicist. I don't think he's going to be there in person because he's like 80-some years old now, but he was colleague of Fred Hoyle, who is really a very distinguished astronomer from England, who wrote a whole bunch of very interesting books, made some serious inroads into understanding how the universe works. Very, very highly esteemed scientist. Chandra was his colleague, and he's going to be beamed in remotely. Probably Alan West, who has been one of the leaders in discovering the evidence for Younger Dryas impact phenomena, is going to be there. And then a bunch of other interesting people. I mean, it's a really interesting group of really smart people who are looking at stuff outside the box.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And the one I went to last year was extremely fun. And meeting all these people, the interesting conversations, that you had. And so I'm really looking forward to this next one. And it's being hosted in a hotel. And the owner of the hotel is a big fan of this work. So he's like putting the whole hotel and all the facilities and everything, just making it available. So it's going to be fun.
Nice. Well, maybe I'll check it out. You got anything coming up other than the Cosmic Summit?
Well, I'm going to be in April next month. I'm going to be doing a weekend Earth Origins in Sedona. And a lot of it's going to be focused on energy and alternative energy. So I'll be presenting some stuff on there. I'll probably be showing a lot of the slides that you and I were just looking at. Those are the only two things I've got scheduled at this point. But I will say that I've been doing for the last, 3.5 years, this Cosmographia podcast with my friends Russ and Kyle Allen and Bradley Young. But those guys have been scattered far and wide around the world, which makes it hard to do a regular weekly podcast. So I'm launching a second, you may say, an auxiliary podcast where I can put shit out every once or twice a week minimum, calling it Squaring the Circle. And so we've got, I think, 4 episodes in the can. I'm going to do an intro episode when I get back home this weekend. And then it should be going online live within 1 to 2 weeks. And perfect. I'm going to be getting into a lot of stuff. It's going to be very eclectic. I'll be talking about current events on there. There's some of the shit that I see going down that pisses me off. I might want to talk about that, the bullshit. But it all fits together. The purveyors of the bullshit want to control the narrative.
Yeah.
They want to control the narrative. They want to control history. This is what dictators and despots and stuff always do, communists, whatever. They want to erase history and rewrite history. You can see what happened to Graham Hancock after Ancient Apocalypse. I don't know if you looked at some of the crap that was posted by mainstream media accusing Graham of, being a, promoter of white supremacy and racism.
Oh, man. I do not pay any attention to mainstream media
Good
anymore.
for you.
That has completely been discredited and is a bunch of garbage.
It's a bunch of garbage.
I have no interest in what talking heads on mainstream media have to say.
But since Graham is a friend of mine, and since I was in the show, I was into the first and the last episode of it, I wanted to see what the critics were saying. And let's see, do they have anything of substance? So I started reading through and I go, there's nothing here. It's just attacks.
Yeah.
Ad hominem, red herrings, and just bullshit. But My takeaway was this, and this is what I found interesting. I read through like 10 or 12 different mainstream criticisms of the show. So supposedly independent news media, right, or the independent source, some from journalists, some from archaeologists, same thing. It was as clear as a bell that they were all reading from the same script, using some of the same phraseology, and I mean, to the point, and I wrote up a long thing showing line by line to make the case that they're all reading from the same script. And I was doing a lecture, in fact, here in Nashville. I was doing a lecture up in Nashville not long after that came out, and I was about 200 people in the audience. And I said, how many of you folks have seen Ancient Apocalypse? And I'm guessing maybe 2/3 of the hands went up. Now, how many of you, your takeaway was that Graham Hancock was promoting white supremacist conspiracy theories? Not one person.
Yeah.
Yet, this is over and over and over again, this is what the mainstream media is saying that he's doing. That he's, I mean, it was so bizarre. And at that point, it was a little bit shocking to me.
It's happening to everybody.
Yeah,
I mean, Russell Brand just got attacked with, sexual allegations. I mean, it's become so common now. I don't think there's, I'm sure there's a portion, I don't know. There's a portion of society that buys into that shit, but it's so common now that it's.
The thing that I was curious about, though, is, okay, somebody has put this script together that they're all reading from, and I'm like, okay, who the hell is this? Who are these people? Who's putting this? Who's sending this out to these different mainstream academic archaeologists and journalists and critics and stuff? And they're all reading it. It had to come from somewhere. Somebody is behind that. In the interest of disclosure, I'd like to know who the hell that is.
Yeah. Who do you think it is?
I don't know. But somebody.
Yeah.
Somebody's there. It's no coincidence that they're all coming up with the same stuff.
I don't think that a lot of people are putting that together, but I think people are starting to wise up to the media. I mean, they're going broke,
Yeah. Well, what's happening is alternative media now is getting stronger and stronger. Mainstream media is getting discredited, and maybe some of them are going, you know what? We better get with the program here, or what's our future?
Yeah.
I hope it's good old-fashioned competition is making them go, okay, we got to start telling the truth once in a while.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really sad what happened, but look what, consequences, now podcasts are on the rise. It's some of the fastest growing media out there. Nobody's watching Hollywood. Nobody's watching mainstream.
Yeah.
It's all turned into garbage.
It's all turned into woke garbage.
Good for us.
Yes, sir.
Podcasters. But
yeah.
Well, Randall, pleasure to meet you, man. It's
likewise, Shawn.
A great time.
I've enjoyed this. Despite the fact that I've been, 4 hours and 2 days, it's been worth it. It's been worth every minute of it.
Well, do you have any recommendations? Any guest recommendations you'd like to see on here?
On here?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, George Howard.
George Howard
would be a good one. And if Jordan Collin is in the country for the Cosmic Summit next summer, he'd be great to get on here.
Okay.
And I'll think about it. I'm sure I can come up with some more because I'm thinking about who I want to get on my podcast.
Right on. Right on.
So, we did the first in-house interview a couple of days ago with Shawn Webb.
I love Shawn.
Yeah, I do too.
He connected us.
And I especially like him because, I can come up here and he does all the driving. So.
Yeah, I'm going to have to get Shawn back on too. But,
well,
hey.
I met Shawn, I guess we think 4 or 5 years ago, and it was through him that I met Ben Johnson, Mushroom Man.
Yeah.
Ex-Navy SEAL.
Yeah.
Mushroom Man, good man. Oh, there you go. Ben, get him on here to talk about his efforts to get federally approved grow license and all that. Yeah, he'd be a good one. And I'm getting him on. He'll probably be my second guest.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. But right now you're ahead of me. You got more views than I do, but I'm climbing, and I think I'm going to be getting on. I'll be on Rumble soon.
Right on.
So that's going to, I think, boost what I got to say, and I got some things to say.
Well, I can't wait to check it out.
Yeah.
So.
I'm a optimistic, happy-go-lucky guy in my own way, but I'm also getting pissed off.
Yeah, a lot of us are.
Yeah.
A lot of us are.
Yeah.
But, well, Randall, I say we go grab some lunch and...
Man, that sounds good.
And thanks for coming out.
Thanks for having me, my friend, my new friend.